Imagine this: your eyes flutter open. But instead of the familiar sight of your bedroom ceiling, you find yourself staring at rough, hewn wooden beams above. The air is cool, heavy with the earthy scent of straw, wood smoke, and livestock that seems far too close for comfort. A thin sliver of light slips through a tiny slit of a window, casting a faint glow on the uneven stone walls. For a moment, your mind scrambles for an explanation. Was there a power outage? Did you fall asleep at some historic site? Slowly, the realization creeps in. This isn't your world. Somehow, some way, you've woken up in the Middle Ages. The first sensation that strikes you is discomfort. Instead of your mattress, you're lying on a rough pile of straw, tied together with old ropes, and covered with a coarse woolen blanket that smells faintly of smoke and sweat. You shift, feeling the prick of straw against your skin. The pillow beneath your head isn't fluffy. It's a lumpy sack stuffed with hay or feathers, hard enough to make you miss your pillow at home instantly. Beside you, the sound of soft breathing suggests you aren't alone. A family stirs in this single-room cottage, everyone crammed together for warmth and survival. Privacy is a luxury of the future, not this time. As your eyes adjust, details sharpen. A small wooden table stands against the wall, rough and uneven, with a clay pot and a few wooden bowls scattered on top. In the corner, chickens rustle softly in a crude pen made of sticks. A goat shifts, bleating faintly, its presence both comforting and jarring. The warmth of animals isn't unusual here. They share your space, part of the household in a very literal sense. Their heat helps ward off the cold, and their sounds are as common as a modern-day hum of traffic. The faint crackle of a candle flame is the only light, its glow dancing across the walls and casting shadows that twist and sway. You notice a woman stirring near the hearth, blowing softly on embers buried in ash, coaxing them back into flame. Soon, the smell of smoke grows sharper as kindling catches fire, and a faint orange glow illuminates the room more fully. She is dressed in a simple tunic, patched and worn, her hair tucked beneath a linen coif. Her movements are steady, practiced, a routine she has likely repeated every morning of her life. Then, a sound that's universal, the crow of a rooster. It cuts through the silence, announcing the start of the day, just as it has for centuries. The man beside you, perhaps the head of this household, stirs, stretching stiff muscles before pulling on rough woolen trousers and a tunic. His hands are calloused, evidence of years of labor. There is no hurry in his movements, yet an unspoken urgency hangs in the air. Daylight is precious, and every moment must be used. You sit up slowly, heart pounding, your modern brain trying to comprehend this alien yet oddly familiar world. The smells are overwhelming, the musk of livestock, the dampness of earth beneath the rushes scattered on the floor, the tang of smoke clinging to everything. Your body feels strangely heavier, as though the weight of this world is pressing down on you. Still, a small part of you thrills at the thought you're in the Middle Ages. Stepping outside the cottage, you're met by the chill of early dawn. Mist clings to the fields beyond, and the first colors of sunrise streak the sky with pink and gold. The village spreads out in front of you. A scattering of cottages like the one you awoke in, smoke rising lazily from their roofs. Chickens peck in the dirt. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, and the faint murmur of voices drifts from neighboring homes as others wake to begin their day. Life here begins early, long before the sun fully rises, because every hour counts when survival is at stake. The sounds are different too. Instead of the hum of cars or the buzz of electricity, there is the rhythmic thud of a wooden mallet as someone splits firewood, the bleat of sheep from a nearby pen, and the splash of water being drawn from the village well. Children run barefoot through the damp grass, their laughter bright but fleeting, quickly silenced by the stern call of a parent reminding them of chores. In this world, even the young have work to do. The villagers eye you with a mixture of indifference and mild curiosity. Outsiders are unusual, but not unheard of, especially if travelers pass through from nearby towns. You feel out of place in your modern clothes. Yet here, appearance is everything. Clothing speaks of rank and role. A peasant's tunic is rough, undyed wool or linen, sometimes patched in a dozen places. Boots are simple leather, often passed down or repaired countless times. Bright colors, fine fabrics, and jewelry belong to the wealthy, and anyone wearing them in a poor village would stand out immediately. As you walk further, you notice the rhythm of medieval life taking shape before you. Women carry baskets filled with grain or vegetables, their bodies bent from years of labor. Men gather with tools slung over their shoulders, heading to the fields. The smell of fresh bread drifts faintly from one home, though bread here is dense, coarse, and far different from what you're used to. What strikes you most is the silence. Without machines, without constant background noise, the village hums with a quiet broken only by human voices, animal calls, and the occasional hammering or chopping of wood. Time itself seems slower, measured not by minutes and seconds, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the turning of the seasons. Standing there, taking it all in, you realize this is no dream. This is life in the Middle Ages, and you are part of it now. The comforts of modernity are gone: no electricity, no running water, no central heating, no quick escape back to convenience. Yet there is something undeniably grounding about it. Here, survival depends on your hands, your community, and your place in the natural order. And so begins your journey. A day in the life of a medieval villager, lived one dawn at a time. The rooster's cry is not a polite alarm clock you can snooze. It is insistent, sharp, and impossible to ignore. In the medieval world, the day starts long before the sun climbs into the sky. And so you rise with the rest of the household. The chill of dawn seeps into your bones as you push aside the rough woolen blanket and step onto the uneven floor, covered in a scattering of straw and rushes meant to soften the hard earth beneath. Your tunic, coarse and scratchy against your skin, is all you have to ward off the cold. There is no wardrobe of options here. Clothing is functional, often worn until it can be patched no more. You pull on simple woolen hose and leather shoes that feel stiff, almost like armor for your feet. The air inside the cottage smells of last night's smoke, mingled with the earthy musk of livestock. There is no escaping it. It is the scent of life itself. The first task of the morning is tending to the animals. You step outside into the damp air, your breath visible in the faint glow of dawn. The village is waking too. Low voices, the clatter of buckets, the muffled bleating of sheep. Beside the cottage, a small pen holds chickens that cluck impatiently as you scatter handfuls of grain. Their feathers brush against your hands as they jostle for position, their movements frantic but oddly comforting. You crouch down, collecting a few eggs still warm from the nest. This is breakfast. Small, fragile gifts from creatures that live side by side with humans. Nearby, the family goat bleats loudly, stamping its hooves. You tie it to a post and settle onto a three-legged stool, pulling at its udder until streams of milk splash into a wooden pail. The sound is steady, rhythmic, almost meditative. The milk will be boiled, perhaps turned into cheese if there is enough. Nothing here goes to waste. Every drop, every crumb, every scrap has value. Survival allows no luxury of wastefulness. The ox waits patiently, a hulking shadow in the dim morning light. You fasten its harness with hands that tremble from the unfamiliar weight of work. For the villagers, these movements are second nature, learned in childhood, performed without thought. But for you, each action feels heavy, clumsy. The ox is more than an animal. It is an engine of survival, strong enough to plow fields and pull loads. Without it, the family's chances of bringing in enough food for the year would dwindle. When the animals are fed and tended, you return to the cottage, where the hearth now glows with fire. The woman of the house stirs a pot, steam curling into the cool air. Breakfast is ready, a thick barley porridge, lumpy and plain, eaten with rough slices of yesterday's bread. The bread is dense, almost gritty, baked with flour mixed with husks. It fills your stomach, but it does not delight the senses. A wooden cup of weak ale is passed around, safer to drink than water from the stream, which is often fouled by waste. The ale is low in alcohol, more nourishing than intoxicating, and even children drink it. You sit at the table with the family, the bowls simple, the spoons carved from wood. There is no silverware, no gleaming plates, just the basics, enough to sustain. Conversation is sparse. Words are saved for necessity, not idle chatter. Work speaks louder than anything else here. As you eat, the small children squirm restlessly, their faces smudged with dirt, their laughter quickly hushed by their parents. Even they have tasks waiting, fetching water, gathering sticks, helping in the fields. Childhood is brief in this world. Responsibility arrives early. After breakfast, the men prepare for the fields. A simple plough waits, its blade dull but serviceable. With the ox in harness, you trudge to the farmland beyond the cottages. The earth is damp, dark, rich with the promise of crops. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These grains are life itself, the backbone of survival. Without a good harvest, there will be hunger in the winter. The work begins guiding the ox, keeping the furrows straight, pushing the plough through the stubborn soil. The task is grueling. Sweat breaking on your brow, though the morning is still cold. Your muscles ache quickly, unaccustomed to such relentless labor. Yet the villagers push on with practiced endurance. The rhythm of farming defines the peasant's world. Spring is for planting, summer for tending, autumn for harvest, and winter for surviving. Everything is tied to the cycle of the seasons. The sun is the clock, the soil the measure of wealth, and the weather a constant threat. Too much rain brings rot, too little brings drought. The balance is fragile, and there is no insurance, no safety net. As the sun climbs higher, you pause for a brief rest, wiping your brow with a rough sleeve. From your vantage point, you see the village more clearly now. A scatter of cottages, smoke drifting lazily into the sky, children running barefoot, women carrying baskets or drawing water from the well. Beyond lies the manor house of the local lord, perched on higher ground, a reminder of the hierarchy that rules this world. You may toil, but the fruits of your labor are not all yours. A portion belongs to the Lord, who provides protection in return. It is a system that binds everyone in obligation, as immovable as the earth beneath your feet. By mid-morning, your back aches, your hands blister, and your stomach grumbles. Yet there is no thought of stopping. The day has only just begun, and the fields demand more. For the peasants, this routine is life, unchanging, unrelenting, yet strangely grounding. In their labor, they find purpose. In the turning of soil, they find continuity with those who came before, and those who will follow. As you glance at the horizon, watching the sunlight scatter across the rolling fields, you realize that this life, though harsh, has its own rhythm, its own strange beauty. It is a world stripped to essentials: food, shelter, work, community. And in this moment, As sweat drips into your eyes, and the ox pulls steadily forward, you are no longer an outsider. You are part of it. The heart of the medieval peasant's diet was simple, repetitive, and heavy on the stomach. Forget about colorful plates piled high with variety. The peasant table knew only the basics: bread, porridge, and ale. These three staples appeared day after day, forming the backbone of survival. To wake up in medieval times was to accept that your meals would rarely surprise you. Bread was more than food. It was life itself. But the bread of the Middle Ages was nothing like the fluffy loaves you might know. Instead, it was dense, coarse, and often gritty with husks and fillers. Wheat, the grain most prized for baking, was expensive and often reserved for the nobility. Ordinary villagers relied on rye, barley, or oats, which produced darker, heavier loaves. The result was bread that could be filling but tough to chew, with a texture more like a brick than a soft roll. Sometimes, less scrupulous bakers cut corners. Flour might be stretched with ground acorns, pea husks, or even chalk to make it last longer. These tricks kept loaves large, but robbed them of both taste and nutrition. Imagine biting into bread that not only tasted bitter, but could also wear down your teeth with tiny gritty fragments of stone or sand. It filled the belly, yes, but it could also leave a mouthful of dust. Next came porridge, or pottage, as it was called. This dish, if it can be called that, was a mixture of whatever grains or vegetables were available, boiled together into a thick stew. On most days, it was nothing more than oats or barley cooked in water, perhaps with onions or beans thrown in for flavor. If luck allowed, a scrap of meat or bone might be added, lending its richness to the pot. Families kept the pottage simmering, adding new ingredients day after day, so that it was less a fresh meal and more an ongoing mixture of everything edible. This endless stew provided sustenance, though not always pleasure. The flavors were bland, sometimes sour, and always familiar. Yet the comfort of a warm bowl on a cold day was not lost on the medieval peasant. It was food that kept you going, and in a world where hunger lurked constantly in the background, that was enough. Ale completed the trio. Water, often polluted by human and animal waste, was risky to drink. Rivers and wells carried disease, invisible threats that could sicken entire villages. All, however, was safer. The brewing process, boiling, fermenting, and storing, killed many of the harmful bacteria. So ale became the everyday drink, consumed by men, women, and children alike. But this was not the strong, heady ale we might imagine today. Medieval ale was weak in alcohol content, designed to nourish rather than intoxicate. It was sometimes called small ale, and it provided hydration and calories without the risk of drunkenness. Brewers, often women known as alewives, kept large pots bubbling, their brew flavored with herbs or spices when available. On rare occasions, stronger ales or wines might appear at feasts or holidays, but for daily life, this thin, earthy drink was the norm. Picture yourself sitting in a one-room cottage, the fire crackling low in the hearth. The family gathers around a rough wooden table. A loaf of dark bread, sliced unevenly, sits at the center. Beside it, a pot of steaming pottage emits a sharp oniony scent, and mugs of cloudy ale are set within reach. Each person dips bread into the stew, soaking up its warmth before chewing slowly, carefully. Conversation is minimal. The food demands attention, and besides, there is little new to say. Meat is absent most days. Cheese and eggs may appear if the animals have been generous, but more often than not, meals remain grain-heavy. Fruits and vegetables are seasonal luxuries, their brief appearance celebrated, before they vanish again with the change of weather. Dried peas, beans, and cabbages provide variety. When fresh produce is gone, though their taste is far from exciting. The monotony of this diet cannot be overstated. Imagine eating essentially the same foods 3 times a day for your entire life. Bread in the morning, bread and pottage at midday, bread and ale at night. Occasionally, the stew pot offers a surprise: a carrot, a scrap of salted pork, a handful of herbs. But these surprises are few and far between. For most, the predictability of meals was a fact of life, unchallenged and unquestioned. And yet, there was a quiet dignity in this repetition. Each loaf of bread represented hours of labor, tilling the soil, sowing seeds, harvesting grain, grinding it into flour, kneading and baking it in smoky ovens. Each mug of ale carried the memory of hands that stirred the brew, watched it bubble, and guarded it against spoiling. These humble foods were symbols of endurance, proof that families could survive another day, despite the odds stacked against them. Still, hunger was never far away. A poor harvest could mean smaller loaves, thinner pottage, weaker ale. Famine struck often, with entire regions reduced to gnawing on bark or boiling weeds when crops failed. In those moments, bread, porridge, and ale became more than monotonous. They became scarce treasures, fought over, prayed for, and mourned when absent. As you take a bite of the dark, chewy bread and sip the sour ale, you realize something profound. These were not luxuries, but lifelines. Medieval peasants did not eat for pleasure, but for endurance. Every mouthful was survival disguised as a meal. And while kings feasted on roasted swan or spiced venison, most people lived on these plain staples. Their bellies full, but their palates forever longing. Life in the Middle Ages was divided sharply between those who had much and those who had little. Nowhere was this contrast more vivid than at mealtimes. While peasants filled their bellies with bread, porridge, and ale, the nobility dined on meats, spices, and delicacies. The gulf between the manor's table and the peasant's bowl was not just about food. It was a reflection of wealth, power, and hierarchy. Step into the great hall of a lord's manor. The long wooden tables are laid out beneath banners and flickering torches. Servants hurry to and fro, carrying trays laden with steaming dishes. At the high table, the lord and his family sit in carved chairs, elevated above the rest. Their plates gleam with roasted meats, beef, pork, venison, or even game birds like swan and peacock. The scent of fat dripping into flames fills the hall, mingling with the sharp tang of imported spices. For the nobility, meals were a stage on which wealth was displayed. Exotic flavors like cinnamon, ginger, and saffron announced status as much as taste. These spices traveled along dangerous trade routes, costing fortunes by the time they reached Europe. To sprinkle them on meat was to prove that you could afford luxuries beyond the imagination of common folk. Even sugar, today so ordinary, was rare and prized, often served as a showpiece in molded shapes. Meals were also an opportunity to demonstrate generosity. Lords invited guests, retainers, and sometimes even the poor to feast at their table. Though the quality of food differed depending on one's station, those seated nearest to the high table enjoyed the choicest cuts, while those farther down the hall received simpler fare. Yet even the leftovers of a noble feast, stews, bread, and diluted wine, would seem extraordinary compared to a peasant's daily meal. In stark contrast, the peasant family ate in a cramped, smoky cottage. Their table was small, often just a rough board balanced on stools. Dinner consisted of the same staples: dark bread, watery pottage, and weak ale. Meat was rare, reserved for holidays, or when an animal was slaughtered out of necessity. On ordinary days, flavor came from onions, leeks, or herbs gathered in the fields. The richness and variety of the manor's table remained a distant dream. But this divide was not simply about taste. It carried deep social meaning. The lord's right to feast was tied to his right to rule. By hosting banquets, he reinforced his power, rewarding loyalty and binding his household together. Food was not just sustenance. It was politics served on a platter. Guests, who ate at the high table, knew their place in the hierarchy, and the rituals of dining made sure everyone else knew it too. Table manners themselves revealed the gap between classes. In the manor, dining was governed by etiquette. Nobles were expected to wash their hands before meals, to eat neatly, and to share trenchers, flat rounds of bread used as plates. They used knives to cut meat but no forks. Instead, they relied on fingers and spoons. Conversation, too, was part of the performance, with witty exchanges and courtly charm adding to the spectacle. Meanwhile, in the peasant home, meals were practical and hurried. Hands tore at bread, spoons dipped into the communal pot, and children ate alongside adults, without ceremony. There was little room for manners when hunger pressed so sharply. Cleanliness was often an afterthought, especially when water was scarce. Where nobles cultivated refinement, peasants prioritized survival. The church played a role in shaping both diets. Fasting days, which could total more than 150 each year, restricted the consumption of meat. For nobles, this meant turning to fish, eggs, and rich dairy products, often prepared with elaborate sauces. For peasants, it meant even leaner meals, fish if they could get it, or simply more pottage with vegetables. The irony was that fasting, intended as spiritual discipline, often highlighted the divide between rich and poor. The wealthy still managed feasts, while the poor were left with little more than scraps. Yet the manor's abundance came at a cost. To maintain such tables, peasants labored endlessly in the fields, growing the grains, raising the livestock, and paying taxes in kind. The bread that sat in the lord's hall was baked with wheat taken as rent from tenants. The venison roasted on the spit came from the forests, where peasants were forbidden to hunt. Each noble meal was, in a sense, carved from the toil of those who went hungry. Imagine yourself invited to the manor for a feast. You would be dazzled by the variety: spiced meats, savory pies, sweet pastries, and perhaps even wine flowing freely. Candles flicker, minstrels play, and laughter fills the air. It feels like stepping into another world. But as you return to your village cottage, the stark reality of the peasant's bowl greets you: plain bread, a thin stew, and a cup of ale. The contrast is jarring, and it underscores the vast gulf that defined medieval life. Over time, this difference in diet reinforced social divisions. Food became a marker of identity. Nobles feasted, peasants endured. To sit at the manor's table was to belong to a privileged circle. To eat from the peasant's bowl was to live in the shadow of want. The daily act of eating, so ordinary on the surface, was in fact a reflection of the medieval world's rigid structure. And yet, whether rich or poor, all were bound by the same truth. Food was fragile. A bad harvest could reduce both manor and village to desperation. In those moments, when famine swept across the land, the illusions of abundance crumbled, and even the Lord's table grew sparse. Hunger, the great equalizer, reminded everyone that beneath the rituals and the hierarchies, survival was still the most basic human need. To live in the Middle Ages was to dance on the edge of plenty and want. On one hand, the era was marked by magnificent feasts, grand spectacles where food flowed in dazzling abundance. On the other, it was haunted by famine, when empty fields and failing harvests brought hunger to the land. This cycle of excess and scarcity shaped not only daily survival, but the rhythm of medieval society itself. Let us first step into the splendor of a feast. Picture a noble's great hall, lit by torches and candles, its stone walls draped with colorful tapestries to block the drafts. Long tables stretch from end to end, laden with roasted meats, fish glazed with honey, and pies stuffed with fruits or spiced venison. Minstrels strike up lively tunes, jugglers perform tricks, and the air buzzes with laughter and chatter. For nobles and their guests, a feast was more than nourishment. It was theater, celebration, and proof of wealth all rolled into one. The dishes themselves often pushed the boundaries of imagination. Cooks delighted in spectacle. A roasted pig might be served with an apple in its mouth, or a swan dressed once again in its feathers, as if alive. Pastries were crafted not just to be eaten but admired, shaped into castles or ships. For the wealthy, food was art and extravagance. Imported spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, flavored the dishes, making them stand apart from the plain meals of peasants. Each bite carried a taste of lands far beyond Europe, brought by merchants braving deserts, seas, and war. These gatherings also marked important moments: weddings, victories in battle, or visits from royalty. The abundance of food declared power and stability. A lord who could host lavish feasts proved his ability to provide, to protect, and to inspire loyalty. Even the church joined in, with feasts held to celebrate saints' days and holy occasions. In a world where hunger was a constant shadow, a well-fed hall proclaimed divine favor. But step outside the castle walls, and the story changes. For peasants, meals were modest even in good years: coarse bread, porridge, and vegetables. A rare treat might be meat from a pig or chicken, but this was usually saved for holidays or weddings. Most days, their food was plain and repetitive, far from the excess of noble feasts. Yet the simplicity carried its own rhythm, life tied to the harvest, meals tied to the soil. When harvests were good, even peasants might feel secure. Grains filled their bins, all brewed in barrels, and salted fish stocked for winter. But the margin between plenty and famine was razor thin. A late frost, a summer drought, or heavy rains could wipe out crops. Suddenly, bellies grew hollow, bread grew scarce, and survival became uncertain. Famine struck often in the Middle Ages, and its memory lingered like a ghost in every household. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is one of the most infamous. Relentless rain ruined crops across northern Europe, drowning fields and rotting grain. Livestock perished from disease, and hay for winter feed was lost. Villages that once echoed with the sound of tools and laughter fell into silence as hunger gnawed at every belly. People grew desperate. Accounts from the time speak of families eating roots, bark, and even grass to stay alive. Bread was stretched with ground acorns or weeds. In some towns, there were whispers of darker acts, of survival pushed to its most terrible limits. The famine did not just starve bodies. It shook faith in the stability of the world itself. For many, hunger felt like divine punishment, a reminder of human fragility under God's will. Even in years without famine, the threat of scarcity hovered close. Winter was a season of testing, when food stores dwindled, and hope turned to the promise of spring. In a peasant's cottage, meals grew thinner as the months dragged on. A family might grind the last of its grain into flour, praying it would last until the next harvest. Each loaf of bread became an act of endurance. The difference between feast and famine was not only fortune but power. Nobles, with their wealth and stores, weathered shortages better than peasants. In times of scarcity, lords might open their granaries to their tenants, offering grain at high prices or in exchange for labor. Charity was sometimes given, but more often it was another form of control. Hunger binding peasants tighter to the land and their lord. The very abundance of noble feasts was possible because the peasants' labor provided it. even as they themselves went without. Yet, despite the hardships, the human spirit endured. Peasants created moments of joy around food when they could. At harvest festivals, they celebrated with what little they had, dancing and singing in gratitude for the crops. On feast days, the church sometimes distributed bread or meat, giving even the poorest a taste of celebration. These occasions, though small compared to the grand banquets of the nobility, offered relief and a reminder of community in the face of hunger. The cycle of feasts and famine taught lessons that echo across history. It revealed the fragility of life in a world bound to the soil, yet also the resilience of those who endured it. To live in the Middle Ages was to understand that every feast was precious, because famine lurked just beyond the horizon. Celebration and suffering were never far apart, and survival itself was an act of balance between the two. So imagine, as you drift through this chapter, the flicker of torchlight in a noble's hall, the laughter of guests over full platters, the warmth of meat and spice. Then step into the silence of a peasant's cottage, where the pot holds only thin broth and the family prays for spring. This was the medieval world, its triumphs and terrors, its fullness and its emptiness, woven together by the eternal hunger for life. When we picture the Middle Ages, castles often rise first in the imagination. Towering stone walls, high battlements, and great keeps standing against the sky. These were not just buildings, but symbols of authority, security, and dominance. To wake up in this medieval world and catch sight of such a fortress would have been to glimpse both awe and intimidation. Yet castles were not always the grand structures we see in films or preserved in ruins today. Their story is one of evolution, adapting to the threats and ambitions of the age. At their heart, castles were machines of control, protecting rulers, cowing enemies, and anchoring feudal power across the land. The earliest castles of medieval Europe were simple affairs known as moat and bailey fortifications. Picture a raised mound of earth, the motti, topped with a wooden tower. At its base spread the bailey, a courtyard enclosed by wooden palisades where villagers, animals, and supplies could be kept in times of danger. Quick to build and relatively cheap, these early castles sprang up in the 10th and 11th centuries, especially in Norman-controlled lands. Their wooden walls were vulnerable to fire, but for lords eager to stake their claim, they were an effective start. As decades passed, wood gave way to stone. Lords who sought permanence invested in stone keeps, massive towers that served as both residence and redoubt. These keeps were designed to withstand sieges, their thick walls nearly impenetrable to arrows or fire. Inside, rooms stacked upon each other held kitchens, halls, and chambers, while narrow staircases wound upward, easy to defend against attackers. To approach such a structure as an enemy would have been daunting. The closer you came, the more impossible it seemed to take. By the 12th and 13th centuries, castles grew more complex. High curtain walls encircled the keep, studded with towers for archers. Gatehouses became formidable obstacles, with heavy portcullises, drawbridges, and murder holes, openings above through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling water, or worse upon assailants. Moats, sometimes filled with water, sometimes dry ditches, added another barrier. Every design choice reflected the brutal logic of medieval warfare. Survive a siege, repel invaders, and remind everyone who held power. But castles were more than fortresses. They were also symbols of prestige. A lord who built an imposing castle announced his wealth and strength to friend and foe alike. Within the walls, life was both practical and ceremonial. The great hall, often at the heart of the castle, served as dining room, courtroom, and stage for entertainment. Here, Guests were dazzled with feasts, musicians, and tapestries, all reminding them of the lord's authority. Daily life in a castle mixed hardship with luxury. The stone walls that seemed so secure from the outside could be damp and cold within. Fires in great hearths provided heat, but also smoke. Windows were narrow slits, letting in little light. Yet nobles enjoyed comforts rare for peasants: roasted meats, fine fabrics, and the service of countless retainers. The contrast between noble life inside and peasant toil outside was stark, and castles embodied that divide. Castles also reshaped the land around them. They became centers of local power, drawing villages to their shadow. Markets formed outside the walls, offering protection and commerce. Roads shifted to connect with their gates. In times of conflict, peasants fled to the safety of the bailey, while lords marshalled soldiers from their strongholds. In this way, castles were not just fortresses, but anchors of entire communities. Of course, no fortress was invincible. As siege technology advanced, so too did the methods of attack. Battering rams, siege towers, and trebuchets hurled stones that could shatter walls. Underminers dug tunnels to collapse fortifications. To hold a castle under siege was a test of endurance. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, and morale faltered. Still, many castles stood strong, and their very existence often deterred enemies from attacking at all. The psychological impact of castles cannot be overstated. For a peasant laboring in the fields, to look up at the looming battlements was to be reminded of authority, both protective and oppressive. For enemies marching across hostile territory, the sight of a fortress on the horizon was a warning: power resides here. In this way, castles were as much about perception as they were about stone. Some castles, like the Tower of London or Windsor, became seats of royal power, their walls bearing witness to coronations, rebellions, and intrigue. Others fell into ruin, abandoned when the expense of upkeep outweighed their utility. Over time, with the rise of gunpowder and cannons in the late Middle Ages, even the strongest castles met their match. Thick stone walls that had once laughed at arrows cracked under the thunder of cannonballs. The age of castles as military fortresses waned, though many remained as palatial homes. For our traveler waking in medieval times, approaching a castle would mean stepping into the center of a lord's world. The drawbridge creaking down, the clang of armor in the courtyard, the smell of roasting meat from the kitchens, all of it would announce a space both forbidding and fascinating. Here, the fates of peasants and nobles alike were decided. Here, in stone, the Middle Ages declared its might. Castles endure today as ruins and tourist attractions, but in their own time, they were living symbols of control, ambition, and survival. Each battlement, each arrow slit, each moat whispered a single truth in the medieval world. Power was not just held, it was built, stone upon stone, until it towered over all who dared to look upon it. In the medieval world, faith was not a private matter tucked away in personal belief. It was the very air people breathed, the thread that bound together daily life, law, and identity. To wake up in medieval times was to enter a world where the church was everywhere, looming in stone cathedrals, echoed in bells that marked the hours, and carried in prayers that framed each day from sunrise to sleep. For the average peasant, life began and ended in the presence of the church. Baptism was the first rite, performed in infancy to cleanse original sin and welcome the child into the Christian community. From that moment onward, the church stood as both spiritual guide and earthly authority. Every Sunday, villagers gathered at the parish church, often the largest and most beautiful building in their community. Its stone walls, decorated with murals or stained glass, offered not just a space for worship, but also a rare glimpse of color and wonder in otherwise simple lives. The rituals of the church gave rhythm to time itself. The liturgical calendar marked the year with feasts, fasts, and holy days. Advent prepared for Christmas, Lent for Easter. Saints' days dotted the months, each celebrated with mass, processions, or local festivals. These occasions were more than religious observances. They were the heartbeats of medieval communities, moments when toil paused and neighbors came together. The church also carried immense earthly power. Bishops and abbots controlled vast lands, rivaling secular lords in wealth and influence. Monasteries collected rents, ran farms, and housed libraries where ancient texts were copied and preserved. In many regions, the church was the single largest landowner, binding the spiritual and the economic into one authority. To defy the church was not merely a matter of belief. It was a challenge to the very order of society. For peasants, the local priest served as mediator between heaven and earth. He performed baptisms, marriages, and funerals. He heard confessions and offered absolution, assuring forgiveness through penance. Even those who could not read or write knew the stories of Scripture through his sermons and the images carved into stone or painted on church walls. In a largely illiterate society, the church was the great teacher, offering a vision of life, death, and eternity. The fear of sin and the hope of salvation were constant companions. Heaven was promised as reward for faithfulness, while hell loomed as the punishment for transgressions. Purgatory, that between realm of cleansing fire, was believed to await many souls before their final ascent. Prayers, pilgrimages, and indulgences were all ways to shorten that passage. This belief gave the church enormous leverage. It did not just guide the faithful in this life. It claimed authority over the next. Monasteries, meanwhile, offered a different path. Men and women who sought to devote themselves fully to God entered monastic life, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Monks rose at midnight for prayers, tilled the fields, copied manuscripts, and lived according to strict rules. Their quiet labor preserved not only faith but also learning. Without monasteries, much of ancient knowledge, from Greek philosophy to Roman history, might have been lost. Cathedrals stood as the crowning achievements of medieval faith. These vast structures, rising higher than any building of their age, were feats of both engineering and devotion. Gothic cathedrals with their pointed arches and stained glass windows drew the eyes upward, lifting minds to heaven. Building one could take generations, with entire towns laboring on a project they might never see finished. Each stone laid was an act of piety as much as construction. Yet the church was not without controversy. Its immense power bred corruption. Bishops sometimes lived more like princes than shepherds, amassing wealth and engaging in politics. Indulgences, sold as a way to reduce time in purgatory, raised funds but also sparked criticism. The gap between the lofty ideals of faith and the reality of worldly power was wide, and cracks in this foundation would eventually lead to upheaval in later centuries. Still, for the ordinary medieval person, faith was less about politics than about survival and meaning. When plagues swept through villages, people turned to prayer. When war burned fields, they sought sanctuary in churches. Crosses marked the roadsides, holy relics drew pilgrims, and bells rang out to chase away storms or call the faithful to Mass. Religion was not separate from life, it was life. Imagine yourself waking in that time, hearing the morning bell echo across the countryside. The sound tells you it is time for prayer, time for work, time for rest. As you walk to the village church, the smell of incense greets you, and Latin chants fill the air. You may not understand the words, but the rhythm of the ritual carries you along, binding you to neighbors, ancestors, and God. The church was both comfort and control, sanctuary and authority. It promised eternal hope while demanding obedience in the present. In the medieval world, faith was not one choice among many. It was the foundation of existence, as solid and immovable as the stone cathedrals that still rise above the towns and fields today. If the village fields and parish church shaped the rhythm of daily life, the market and the fair brought a sudden pulse of energy. To wake up in medieval times was to live mostly within a few miles of your birthplace, tied to land and seasons. But once a week, or a few times a year, the world widened when traders, craftsmen, and farmers converged to exchange goods. Markets and fairs were not just places of commerce, they were windows into a larger, more colorful world. The weekly market was the heartbeat of many towns. In small villages, it might be held in an open square, with rough wooden stalls shaded by canvas or thatch. Farmers carried baskets of eggs, bundles of onions, or sacks of grain to sell. Housewives came to barter for salt, cloth, or pots. The sounds of haggling filled the air, coins clinking, animals bleating, voices calling out their wares. The smell was just as vivid: fish laid out on planks, spices crushed underfoot, bread fresh from ovens, mingled with less pleasant notes of manure and sweat. Markets were strictly regulated. Lords or town councils set tolls and fees for stalls. Weights and measures were inspected to prevent cheating. Though sharp, dealing was never absent. The presence of officials gave a sense of order, but markets were always alive with the unpredictability of human exchange. A skilled haggler could shave a few pennies off a price, while the unwary might walk away with watered ile or spoiled meat. For peasants who rarely traveled, the market offered a glimpse of the exotic: cloth from Flanders, iron tools, or even rare spices might appear on stalls. Though most villagers could not afford luxuries, the sight of them stirred imagination. Children gawked at brightly colored ribbons, tin trinkets, or carved wooden toys. To wander through a market was to touch, smell, and taste possibilities beyond the horizon of ordinary life. More spectacular still were the great annual fairs. These were larger gatherings, often lasting days or weeks, drawing merchants from distant lands. Famous fairs, such as those in Champagne in France or St. Ives in England, became hubs of international trade. Caravans arrived loaded with silks from the east, furs from the north, wine from the south, and wool from the English countryside. Tents stretched across fields, creating a temporary city, buzzing with languages and accents. For a medieval villager, attending such a fair was overwhelming. Imagine stepping into a throng of thousands, the colors and scents dizzying. Jugglers and minstrels entertained on the edges, while merchants hawked goods in every direction. Bells rang, trumpets sounded, and criers announced the arrival of caravans. It was both commerce and carnival, business and spectacle. Fairs were also social crossroads. News traveled along trade routes faster than through royal couriers, so fairs became centers of information. A peasant might hear rumors of distant wars, tales of kings and battles, or whispers of plague and famine. Travelers swapped stories, songs, and ideas, spreading culture alongside goods. For many, this was their one brush with a world beyond their own fields. The economic importance of markets and fairs cannot be overstated. They linked rural producers with urban consumers, knit together distant regions, and fueled the rise of towns. A peasant selling surplus grain at market could earn coins to pay rent or buy tools. Towns collected fees that funded walls, bridges, or cathedrals. Merchants grew rich, forming guilds that wielded political influence. The steady hum of market stalls and the seasonal roar of fairs laid the groundwork for Europe's expanding economy. But markets and fairs were not without danger. Crowds attracted pickpockets, swindlers, and conmen. Money changers could cheat with false scales, and traveling merchants might disappear with deposits. Violence sometimes flared when drunken brawls broke out or rival townsmen clashed. Disease, too, found fertile ground in crowded markets. The movement of goods and people helped spread not only wealth, but also illnesses, with fleas and rats stowing away in carts and sacks. Despite these risks, the lure of the market was irresistible. For villagers bound to the cycle of ploughing and harvest, it offered variety, excitement, and possibility. The fair especially was a chance to step out of the ordinary. A young girl might see a necklace she dreamed of owning. A boy might watch a juggler and imagine a wandering life. And parents might find both the goods they needed and the gossip that kept them connected to the wider world. As evening fell, torches flickered across the stalls, shadows dancing over bolts of cloth and piles of produce. The crowd thinned, but laughter and music drifted into the night. For a moment, life felt larger, richer, more vibrant. And then, as the fair ended and merchants packed their goods, the villagers returned home to their cottages and fields, carrying with them not just purchases but memories, stories, and the faint shimmer of a world beyond their village lanes. To wake up in medieval times was to know toil and limitation. But on market day, and most of all during the fair, the boundaries of that small world stretched open, just enough to let in wonder. From a distance, castles looked like solid stone giants planted on hills and cliffs, looming over the countryside with their towers and battlements. To wake up in medieval times and find yourself within castle walls would be like stepping into another world. For villagers, the castle was a place of awe and power, sometimes refuge, sometimes prison, always authority made visible in stone. The first impression was its size. Even a modest stone keep dwarfed the timber cottages of peasants. Walls thick enough to withstand siege stretched high, sometimes ringed with moats. Gates bristled with iron, and portcullises hung ready to drop. For those who lived outside, these walls promised safety during war, though entry came at a cost of loyalty and service. Inside, however, castle life was far from the fairy tales we imagine today. The great hall was the beating heart. Long, drafty, and dimly lit by flickering torches, it served as dining room, courtroom, and reception area. A lord sat at the high table beneath a banner bearing his coat of arms, while retainers, knights, and servants filled benches below. Meals were eaten not in quiet ceremony, but amid noise, chatter, and clatter. Dogs prowled underfoot for scraps, musicians might play, and jesters cracked jokes. Food was hearty, but not always refined roasted meats, trenchers of bread, pottage stews, and flagons of ale. Spice, when available, added a flash of wealth and sophistication. Beyond the hall, the private chambers of the lord and lady offered more comfort. Tapestries softened the chill of stone walls, and carved chests held clothing, jewels, and documents. Even here, warmth was fleeting. Fires crackled, but drafts slipped through cracks, and the scent of smoke clung to everything. For women of the household, the chambers were also workplaces. Embroidery, correspondence, and the management of servants filled their hours. Castles were busy, almost self-contained communities. Blacksmiths shaped iron tools and horseshoes. Bakers worked in smoky ovens. Cooks bustled in kitchens heavy with the smell of meat and herbs. Servants scurried through passageways, carrying trays, fetching water, or tending fires. Stable hands cared for horses, while falconers trained hawks for hunting. Guards patrolled the walls, their armor clinking in steady rhythm. Life inside demanded constant labor, and the hum of activity never ceased. Yet not everyone inside the castle lived in splendor. Servants slept in cramped quarters, sometimes on floors or in cold chambers. Sanitation was rudimentary. Garderobes emptied, waste threw chutes into moats or pits. Vermin thrived, and disease could spread quickly in the enclosed environment. For all the grandeur of towers and turrets, daily discomfort was unavoidable. Children of the nobility experienced a different rhythm. Boys were trained as pages, learning manners, swordplay, and horsemanship. By their teens, they became squires, serving knights directly and preparing for knighthood. Girls, meanwhile, were instructed in managing households, weaving, and sometimes music or reading. Both were groomed to uphold family honor and secure alliances through marriage. The castle, for them, was both a school and a stage where futures were arranged. Amid these routines, leisure and ceremony also had their place. Feasts celebrated victories, holidays, or important visits. Hunting was both sport and training, with men on horseback and women sometimes joining with falcons on their arms. Tournaments, though often staged outside castle grounds, were organized by lords and brought excitement and prestige. Music, poetry, and storytelling echoed through the great hall, weaving entertainment into the fabric of martial life. Politically, the castle was a stronghold of authority. Here, justice was dispensed. A lord heard disputes, levied fines, or commanded punishments. His seal authenticated documents. His word settled quarrels. For villagers, to step into the hall was to step into law itself. The castle projected order, but it also reminded everyone of the hierarchy that defined medieval life. And then, of course, there was war. Castles were designed for defense. Arrow slits, murder holes, and drawbridges were not decorations but deadly tools. During a siege, inhabitants withdrew within the walls, storing grain, water, and livestock. The great hall transformed into a shelter, its laughter replaced by tension and fear. Archers stood at battlements, boiling water or oil readied to pour on attackers. For weeks or months, life became survival, every sound outside the wall a potential threat. Still, to live within a castle was to live at the center of medieval society's highest expressions of power. It was a place where alliances were sealed, where banners flew, and where kings might pass through on progress. For common folk, the castle was distant, almost mythical. But for those within its walls, whether lord, lady, knight, or servant, it was daily life, noisy, crowded, smoky, uncomfortable, yet charged with prestige and purpose. As torches guttered and shadows stretched along the stone corridors, the castle settled into uneasy rest. Guards kept watch from towers, the smell of damp stone lingered, and the walls seemed to breathe with centuries of history. To wake up in medieval times inside a castle was to wake up inside the beating heart of power, where grandeur and hardship walked hand in hand. If castles were the bones of medieval society, knights were its muscle and spirit. To wake in this world and encounter a knight would be to meet both warrior and symbol. For knighthood carried not only the weight of sword and shield, but the ideals of honor, loyalty, and service. Yet behind the shining armor and tales of valor lay a demanding life of training, hardship, and performance. The path to knighthood began young. A boy of noble birth, sometimes as early as 7, was sent away from home to serve as a page in another lord's household. Life as a page was one of discipline and instruction. He learned manners, recited prayers, and practiced reading if tutors were available. More importantly, he served at tables, carried messages, and observed the codes of conduct that would later define chivalry. At 14, a page might be promoted to squire, and the world changed. A squire lived closer to battle. He cared for his master's armor and weapons, tended horses, and rode at his side in the hunt or campaign. He practiced with wooden swords, drilled in horsemanship, and learned the weight of real armor. The bruises and exhaustion of training hardened him. In war, squires sometimes fought, their courage tested long before the ritual of knighthood. The ceremony itself, when it came, was a powerful rite, a vigil in a chapel, a night of prayer, the symbolic bath to purify the body. These marked the threshold. Then came the dubbing, when the lord struck the young man lightly on the shoulder with a sword, declaring him knight. At that moment, the squire joined an elite brotherhood, sworn to defend faith, protect the weak, and serve loyally. The reality was not always as noble as the words, but the image mattered deeply. Armor became the knight's second skin. Early mail coats of interlinked rings gave way to the gleaming plate harnesses of later centuries. Helmets, shields, and surcoats emblazoned with coats of arms made knights visible and identifiable in battle. The clank of steel, the weight of 40 or 50 pounds of protection, and the careful care of squires all defined daily life. Knights were not only warriors, they were walking symbols of their lord's prestige. And where knights gathered, tournaments followed. More than martial sport, tournaments were theatre, training ground, and spectacle rolled into one. Picture a field cordoned off with wooden barriers, banners flapping in the wind, noble ladies watching from pavilions, and trumpets sounding. Knights, armored and mounted, paraded before the crowd, their shields painted with colors and emblems that told stories of lineage and allegiance. The melee was the earliest form, a chaotic clash of knights fighting in groups, simulating battle. It was dangerous, often deadly, and sometimes more brawl than contest. Later came the jest, the iconic tilt of two armored men charging with lances lowered. Horses thundered, wood splintered, and the shock of impact could unseat even the strongest rider. Victory meant not only honor, but often ransom, as defeated knights were captured and released for a fee. For the spectators, tournaments were entertainment. For knights, they were tests of skill and reputation. Success could win a man fame, fortune, and even the attention of powerful patrons. Failure, however, could bring humiliation or worse, as accidents were frequent and brutal. Helmets dented, bones shattered, and lives ended in what was, at heart, a staged rehearsal for war. Chivalry threaded through this martial world. The code was an ideal rather than a universal reality, but it shaped expectations. Knights were to show loyalty to their lords, courage in battle, courtesy to women, and mercy to the defeated. Literature celebrated these values. Tales of King Arthur and his Round Table, chansons of Roland, romances of Lancelot. Whether knights lived up to them or not, the stories gave meaning to their role. Yet contradictions abounded. Knights sworn to protect the weak sometimes pillaged villages. They might swear oaths of piety yet fight in wars of ambition. The Crusades, where thousands of knights marched under the cross, revealed both their religious zeal and their brutality. Honor and violence were intertwined, and the gleam of chivalry often concealed the rough edges of reality. Beyond war and tournaments, knights played key roles in their lords' courts. They acted as advisors, messengers, and enforcers. Their presence at feasts, councils, and hunts reinforced the martial tone of noble life. To wear a knight's spurs was to bear responsibility as much as privilege. A constant performance of strength and loyalty. For those waking in medieval times, encountering a knight might mean awe or fear. To peasants, knights could be both protectors and oppressors. To nobles, they were vital instruments of power. To fellow knights, they were rivals and comrades. Always, they embodied the martial heart of the age. And when the trumpets faded, and the dust of the tournament field settled, knights returned to their castles or campaigns, carrying bruises and pride alike. Their lives were forged in steel and bound by ideals that both elevated and constrained them. To live as a knight was to walk a narrow path between glory and hardship, honor and violence, legend and reality. When you picture the Middle Ages, it's easy to imagine armored knights, stern kings, or robed monks filling the stage. Yet half of society, women, shaped medieval life in quieter, enduring ways. Their experiences, though often hidden in chronicles written by men, were complex and varied, ranging from peasant cottages to noble courts, and even convents. To wake in this era and step into a woman's shoes would reveal both limitations and unexpected forms of power. For most women, life revolved around the household and the rhythms of survival. In a peasant village, a woman's day began before dawn. She rose to stoke the hearth, prepare coarse bread or porridge, and tend to children. Work was constant, spinning wool, weaving cloth, tending gardens, helping in the fields during harvest. She might brew ale, a common household task, or keep chickens and goats for food. Her labor supported not only her family, but the entire village economy. Marriage was often arranged, more a matter of necessity than romance. Women married young, sometimes in their early teens, and bore children early. Childbirth was dangerous, and many women faced the risk of death in labor. Still, children were precious, both as heirs and as extra hands for work. A woman's status was deeply tied to her ability to manage the household and produce heirs. Yet women were not confined solely to domestic duties. In towns, they worked in markets, sold goods, and practiced trades alongside their husbands. Some joined guilds as brewers, weavers, or midwives. Widows, in particular, often enjoyed more independence, able to inherit property, run businesses, or manage farms. The death of a husband could be devastating, but it sometimes brought a measure of autonomy otherwise denied. Among the nobility, women's lives looked different, but were equally constrained by duty. A noblewoman managed estates in her husband's absence, overseeing servants, collecting rents, and even defending castles during siege. Some acted as patrons of art, music, or religious institutions, using wealth and position to leave cultural legacies. Courtly life offered more refinement, but also more scrutiny. How a lady dressed, spoke, and behaved reflected on her entire family. Marriage among the noble classes was almost entirely political. Daughters were pawns in alliances between families. Their hands promised to secure land, wealth, or peace. A young girl might be betrothed before she even understood what marriage meant. Her role was to bring honor to her husband's house, produce heirs, and maintain the fragile networks of kinship that defined medieval politics. Religion offered both refuge and restriction. Many women entered convents, some by choice, others by family decision. In the cloister, they lived lives of prayer, study, and work. For some, this was empowering. Women like Hildegard of Bingen rose to prominence as mystics, writers, and advisors, wielding spiritual authority that transcended their gender. Convents also preserved learning, with nuns copying manuscripts and contributing to theology, music, and medicine. Yet even here, church hierarchies kept women beneath the authority of male clergy. The ideals of femininity were shaped by religion as much as by culture. The Virgin Mary stood as the model of purity, humility, and obedience. At the same time, biblical figures like Eve were invoked as symbols of temptation and sin, casting suspicion on women's desires and independence. Literature reflected this tension. Songs celebrated ladies as objects of courtly love, while sermons warned of their dangers. Women lived within these contradictions, navigating respect and suspicion in equal measure. law reinforced the limits of female autonomy. In many regions, women could not own property independently once married. Their legal identity was absorbed into their husbands, a concept later known as coverture. Their testimonies in court often carried less weight than a man's, and their ability to act in public life was curtailed. Exceptions existed, but the general framework was one of dependence. And yet, history is full of women who stepped beyond these boundaries. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled vast lands, influenced 2 kings, and participated in the Crusades. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl, led French armies under divine visions before meeting her tragic end. Queens, abbesses, merchants, and even rebels carved out space for themselves in a male-dominated world. Their stories remind us that women were never passive spectators of history, but active participants in shaping it. In the daily lives of most, however, resilience was the defining trait. Imagine the woman you meet in the medieval village, where you awoke. She balances a basket of firewood on her hip, a child tugging at her sleeve, her hands rough from labor. She may not wield a sword or sit on a throne, but her work sustains the community. Her endurance in the face of endless toil and limited freedom is its own form of strength. As the candlelight flickers in a peasant's cottage or a noblewoman's hall, the lives of medieval women reveal themselves as both restricted and resilient. They bore children, worked the land, preserved traditions, and in rare cases, stepped into roles of extraordinary power. To wake in their world is to see not only the limits imposed by law and custom, but also the quiet determination with which they carved meaning and survival from their days. If you awoke in medieval times as a child, your world would be both familiar and strange. The laughter of play, the bonds of family, and the curiosity of young minds were as present then as now. But the experience of childhood in the Middle Ages was shaped by harsh realities. Short life expectancies, constant labor, and expectations far heavier than most modern children could imagine. Childhood, in many ways, was fleeting. Infants were fragile, and disease claimed many within their first years. Parents often baptized newborns quickly, sometimes within days. Out of fear, they might not survive long enough to receive the sacrament. The loss of children was heartbreakingly common. So much so that medieval families sometimes struggled to fully separate grief from resignation. To raise a child who survived into adulthood was both a blessing and an achievement. From the moment a child could walk and talk, they were expected to contribute. In peasant villages, little ones helped gather firewood, herd geese, or chase birds from crops. By 7 or 8, boys might assist in plowing or carrying water, while girls were taught to spin, cook, and care for siblings. Play and chores blurred together. Games with sticks doubled as training for later work, and songs sung at the hearth passed down cultural memory. Childhood was not idle, it was preparation. Education varied dramatically by class. For peasant children, formal schooling was rare. Knowledge was transmitted through experience, learning to sow, reap, cook, and mend by watching elders. For the sons of nobles, however, the path was structured. At around 7, a boy might be sent to another household as a page, beginning his training in manners, literacy, and martial skills. By adolescence, he could become a squire, already tied to the world of combat and duty. Girls of noble birth also received training, though theirs focused on household management, needlework, and courtly manners. Some learned to read, especially if destined for convent life, but many were taught primarily to prepare for arranged marriages. Childhood for noble girls often ended shockingly early. Betrothals at 12 or 13 were not unusual, with marriages following soon after. Yet even in these conditions, children played. Archaeological finds reveal small carved toys, wooden horses, dolls, miniature swords. They played ball games, wrestled, and sang rhymes, not so different in spirit from modern playground chants. Festivals and holy days brought special excitement. Maypoles to dance around, fires to leap, and sweets or bread saved for treats. Even in hardship, children found joy in the small rhythms of life. The church held strong views on childhood. Children were seen as innocent souls, in need of guidance and discipline. Obedience to parents was stressed, as was learning the catechism and basic prayers. Stories of saints and biblical tales were told to shape moral behavior. Yet there was also tenderness. Illustrated manuscripts show images of children at play, cared for by mothers, or nestled at the edge of family gatherings. Adolescence as a concept was less recognized. By 12 or 14, children were considered on the threshold of adulthood. Peasant boys might already labor as full workers in the fields, and girls might marry. Apprenticeships often began in the early teens, pulling young people into trades or crafts that would define their futures. What today we think of as teenage years was, in medieval times, more a direct leap into responsibility. Still, some childhood experiences transcended centuries. The bond between parent and child, despite the dangers of disease, remained strong. Mothers worried over sick little ones, fathers taught sons to work the soil, and families celebrated milestones together. Children were loved, cherished, and disciplined, sometimes harshly, but often with deep affection. Imagine waking in that era as a child. The cool dirt beneath your bare feet, the rough tunic itching against your skin, the smell of bread baking in the hearth. You would spend your mornings running between furrows, your afternoons learning tasks from older siblings, your evenings falling asleep to the sound of stories murmured by firelight. The world would feel vast and mysterious, yet tightly bound to the rhythms of survival. In comparison to today, medieval childhood appears shorter, harsher, and more constrained. Modern children are often shielded from responsibility, given years of schooling and leisure. Yet both then and now, the essence of childhood, curiosity, laughter, and the forging of identity remains constant. The medieval child, though shaped by different circumstances, was no less alive with imagination, no less eager to explore and dream. When we look back across the centuries, it's easy to see the differences in opportunity, education, and freedom. But there is comfort, too, in recognizing the continuity. The giggles of children chasing each other in a village lane echo the same joy heard on playgrounds today. Life may have been shorter, but childhood, in its simplest moments, carried the same spark. If you found yourself waking up in the Middle Ages with an ache, fever, or wound, you would quickly realize just how different medicine was compared to modern times. The science of germs, antibiotics, and sterile instruments lay centuries in the future. Instead, healing was a mixture of ancient theory, religious belief, superstition, and folk remedies passed down through generations. The dominant framework for medicine in medieval Europe came from the ancient world, particularly the writings of the Greek physician Galen. His theories revolved around the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health, it was believed, depended on keeping these humours in balance. Sickness was the result of imbalance, and treatment aimed to restore harmony. If you had a fever, physicians might argue your body had too much blood and prescribe bloodletting. If you were melancholy, they might diagnose excess black bile. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. Physicians used knives, leeches, or even cupping bowls to draw blood from the patient. It was believed to purge impurities, but often left the sick even weaker. In some cases, the procedure was deadly. Yet the practice persisted for centuries, a testament to the enduring influence of humoral theory. Beyond bloodletting, other remedies included purging through vomiting or laxatives, applying herbal poultices, or adjusting diet. Physicians recommended foods believed to cool or warm the body, moistening or drying the humors as needed. Garlic, onions, fennel, sage, and rosemary were common herbs, while honey was prized for its supposed healing properties. Some treatments contained a kernel of truth. Garlic does have antibacterial qualities, but most were hit or miss. For peasants, access to physicians was rare. Medical knowledge was concentrated in monasteries, universities, and among the wealthy. Instead, villagers turned to folk healers, midwives, and wise women. These local practitioners used herbal remedies, charms, and practical experience. A poultice of comfrey might be applied to a broken bone, or chamomile tea brewed for stomach pains. Midwives were especially important, guiding women through childbirth, which was a perilous process in every class of society. Religion also shaped healing. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God or a trial of faith. Pilgrimages to shrines of saints, prayers, and the use of holy relics were common practices. People might touch the bones of a saint, drink holy water, or wear amulets inscribed with prayers for protection. Miraculous cures were sought as much as earthly remedies. Monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and practicing medicine. Monks tended herb gardens filled with medicinal plants like lavender, sage, and thyme. They copied medical texts and treated both fellow monks and local villagers. Some monasteries gained reputations as centers of healing, offering care that was more organized and systematic than what most peasants could access. Yet medicine was not free from superstition. Astrology often guided diagnosis and treatment. Physicians consulted the positions of the stars and planets to determine the best times for bloodletting or surgery. Certain illnesses were linked to celestial alignments, and horoscopes were drawn to predict the course of disease. Magic and charms mingled freely with herbal remedies, blurring the line between science and superstition. Surgery in the Middle Ages was a brutal affair. Surgeons, often considered a lower class of healer compared to physicians, were tasked with treating wounds, setting bones, and performing amputations. Without anesthesia, patients endured the agony of procedures fully conscious, restrained by attendants. Infection was rampant, as there was no understanding of sterilization. Still, surgeons developed practical techniques, and some even achieved surprising success with trepanation, drilling holes into the skull to relieve pressure. The Black Death in the 14th century tested medieval medicine like never before. Physicians scrambled to explain the plague, offering theories ranging from poisoned air, miasma, to divine punishment. Remedies included burning aromatic herbs, carrying posies of flowers, and fleeing infected cities. Some physicians wore the now iconic beaked masks filled with herbs, a primitive attempt at filtering air. But medicine could not stop the devastation. Millions perished despite desperate measures. Despite its limitations, medieval medicine laid the groundwork for future progress. Universities began to formalize medical training in the 12th century, particularly in places like Salerno and Montpellier. Physicians studied texts by Galen, Hippocrates, and Arab scholars like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was highly influential. Though still bound by humoral theory, these centers of learning marked a slow step towards systematic inquiry. If you woke up in this world, a simple wound or infection could prove deadly. A scratch that today would heal in days might fester into a fatal abscess. Childbirth carried immense risk, with mortality rates for mothers and infants heartbreakingly high. Yet people persevered, relying on their faith, their communities, and the knowledge passed down through trial and error. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, fever burning in your veins. A healer enters, carrying a bundle of herbs and muttering a prayer. She presses a compress of rosemary to your forehead, sprinkles holy water near the hearth, and offers you a draught of bitter ale laced with ground roots. There is no guarantee it will work, but it is given with care and belief. In such moments, medicine was as much about comfort as cure. Today, we can look back with gratitude at the advances that separate us from those days. But we can also marvel at the resilience of medieval people, who endured illness with limited tools, yet managed to preserve and pass on knowledge that would, centuries later, blossom into modern medicine. Their world was one of uncertainty and risk, but also of persistence and hope. When we think of castles today, images of towering stone walls, drawbridges, and grand banquet halls spring to mind. They look like fortresses straight out of fairy tales. But in the Middle Ages, castles were not only military strongholds, they were also homes, workplaces, and centers of administration. If you had woken up inside a medieval castle, you would have found a world both impressive and surprisingly uncomfortable. At the heart of castle life was the lord and his family. Nobles lived within the thick stone walls, protected from enemies, but also isolated from the outside world. The castle symbolized wealth and power, but daily life was far from luxurious by modern standards. Heat was scarce, drafts whistled through narrow windows, and the smell of smoke, sweat, and food lingered in every hall. The Great Hall was the social center of the castle. Here meals were eaten, guests were entertained. An important business was conducted. Imagine a cavernous room with a high wooden roof, long trestle tables, and a massive hearth at one end. Servants bustled about, carrying trays of bread, roasted meats, and ale. At feasts, musicians played lutes, jesters performed tricks, and the lord displayed his generosity by feeding not only family and knights, but also visiting guests and even peasants on special occasions. Food in the castle reflected wealth. While peasants dined on bread, porridge, and vegetables, the noble family enjoyed venison, wild boar, swan, and peacock. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper, imported from distant lands, were used to season dishes, signaling status as much as taste. However, despite the variety, the food was often heavy and greasy. Plates were typically made of stale bread called trenchers, which absorbed juices before being thrown to dogs or the poor. Beneath the glamour of feasts lay the work of countless servants and retainers. A steward managed the household, while cooks labored in smoky kitchens, scullions scrubbed pots, and laundresses washed clothes in icy water. Stable hands tended to horses, and squires attended knights. A castle was a hive of activity, with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people ensuring that the lord's household functioned smoothly. Knights and soldiers also lived within the castle walls. Their duty was to defend the lord's lands and uphold his authority. When not at war, they trained in the courtyard, practicing with swords, lances, and shields. Jousting tournaments provided both entertainment and preparation for combat. Squires, young men in training, shadowed knights, learning the skills of warfare as well as the codes of chivalry. Religion was woven into daily routine. Most castles had their own chapel, where priests held mass each morning. Nobles attended regularly, and prayers were said before meals. Faith was not only a matter of belief, but also a way of reinforcing authority, reminding all within the castle that their lord ruled under the watch of God. While castles appear grand, living conditions were often harsh. Stone walls trapped dampness, and in winter, rooms were bitterly cold. Fireplaces provided limited warmth, and smoke clung to clothes and hair. Sanitation was primitive, latrines or garderobes emptied into cesspits or moats, leaving a foul stench that never quite disappeared. Fleas and lice were constant companions, even for nobles. The lord's lady held significant responsibilities within the castle. She managed the household, supervised servants, and ensured supplies were stocked. When her husband was away at war or on political duties, she often oversaw the entire estate, making her a powerful figure in her own right. Noblewomen also engaged in embroidery, music, and reading, but their days were filled with administrative and social obligations. Children of noble families were raised within the castle walls, though their upbringing was shaped by duty rather than indulgence. Boys were sent as pages to learn manners, horsemanship, and combat before becoming squires. Girls were trained in household management, needlework, and the expectations of noble marriage. Childhood was short, as alliances and responsibilities awaited them by their teenage years. Life in the castle also included entertainment. Storytellers recited epic tales of heroes and battles, while minstrels performed songs of courtly love. Hunting was a favorite pastime of the nobility, with hawks, hounds, and elaborate hunts through the forest. Falconry, in particular, symbolized refinement, with trained birds soaring to capture prey. These activities were not merely diversions. They reinforced the nobility's identity as warriors and rulers. But castles were more than private homes. They were symbols of control. From their towers, lords could watch over surrounding villages, fields, and roads. The castle provided refuge during attacks, its walls a barrier against raiders and rival armies. Villagers might flee to the safety of the gates when danger loomed, bringing livestock and belongings with them. For the people outside, the looming silhouette of the castle reminded them daily of their lord's dominance. If you were inside a medieval castle, your experience depended heavily on your role. As a noble, you lived with status, but endured cold halls and constant obligations. As a servant, your days were filled with exhausting labor, ensuring meals were prepared, fires kept burning, and clothes maintained. As a soldier, you trained for war and swore loyalty to your lord. Each role intertwined, making the castle not just a fortress but a living, breathing community. It is easy to romanticize castles as places of grandeur, but their reality was complex. A mixture of power and discomfort, wealth and hardship, elegance and filth. They were both symbols of security and reflections of the rough, uncertain age in which they stood. To wake up in one would mean stepping into a world of ritual, responsibility, and rigid hierarchy, where every stone told a story of authority and survival. While lords lived behind stone walls and knights rode into battle, the vast majority of people in medieval Europe lived far humbler lives. The peasants, men, women, and children who worked the land, formed the foundation of the entire social order. Without their labor, castles would stand empty and armies would go hungry. To wake up as a peasant in medieval times was to step into a life defined by toil, community faith, and survival. A peasant's day began long before sunrise. The sound of a rooster crowing, or the toll of a village church bell, signaled that work awaited. Climbing from a straw-filled mattress in a wooden or mud-walled hut, a peasant family dressed in coarse woolen tunics, patched hose, and simple leather shoes. Their cottages were small, often one room, shared with chickens, goats, or even a cow. Smoke from the central hearth blackened the rafters, and a faint draught slipped through cracks in the walls. Breakfast was plain, but filling. Dark bread, perhaps porridge made from oats or barley, and weak ale or watered milk. Tea and coffee were unknown luxuries, and water was often unsafe to drink. Fueling up on such modest fare was necessary, for the day ahead would demand every ounce of strength. Most peasants worked as serfs, bound to the land of a local lord. In exchange for protection and a small strip of farmland to cultivate, they owed labor and taxes. This meant tending the lord's fields several days each week in addition to working their own plots. Others, known as free peasants, paid rent but had more independence, though life was still harsh and precarious. The rhythm of a peasant's year followed the seasons of agriculture. Spring brought plowing and sowing. Summer meant endless days of weeding and haymaking. Autumn demanded harvesting, and winter focused on mending tools and caring for animals. Each season brought its own urgency. Plant too late, and crops would fail. Harvest too slowly, and food would spoil. The survival of the entire village rested on careful timing and relentless labor. In the fields, peasants wielded wooden plows drawn by oxen, sickles for cutting grain, and flails for threshing wheat. Work was backbreaking and unending. Sunburn, calloused hands, and aching backs were constant companions. Yet peasants often sang as they worked, their voices rising in folk songs that lightened the monotony and bound the community together. Despite hardship, there were small joys. During harvest, villages came alive with festivals celebrating the gathering of crops. Ale flowed, music played, and dances spiraled across the village green. These moments of merriment reminded peasants that life, though hard, had rhythms of joy as well as labor. Food for peasants was simple, but surprisingly nourishing. Their diet revolved around bread made from rye or barley, pottage, a stew of grains, vegetables, and herbs, and whatever could be foraged, berries, nuts, or mushrooms. Meat was rare, usually eaten only on feast days, or when hunting small game. On Fridays and during Lent, religious fasting meant meals without meat or dairy, relying heavily on fish and vegetables. Hunger was never far away. A poor harvest or harsh winter could mean famine. The village community was the heart of peasant life. Families lived close together, their cottages clustered around a church or green. Everyone knew one another, and survival depended on cooperation. Neighbors shared tools, helped repair cottages, and worked side by side in the fields. Disputes arose, of course, but the bond of necessity held the village together. Children were not shielded from responsibility. From a young age, they fetched water, gathered firewood, scared birds from crops, or tended livestock. By adolescence, they worked nearly as hard as adults. Schooling was rare, though some villages had priests who taught boys basic reading and Latin prayers. Most peasants, however, passed down knowledge orally, songs, proverbs, and farming techniques preserved through generations. Religion was woven deeply into every aspect of life. The village church stood at the center, its bell marking hours of prayer, festivals, and moments of crisis. Peasants looked to the church for spiritual comfort and guidance, believing that suffering on earth might be repaid with peace in heaven. Saints' days, processions, and feast days punctuated the agricultural calendar, providing both sacred observance and precious respite from labor. Peasant women bore heavy responsibilities. They worked in the fields alongside men, spun wool, brewed oil, prepared meals, and cared for children. They mended clothing, tended small gardens of herbs and vegetables, and milked animals. Their labor was constant and often invisible, yet absolutely vital. Without their efforts, households would crumble. Taxes weighed heavily on peasants. Beyond giving part of their harvest to the Lord, they also owed tithers, 1/10 of their produce, to the church. Some paid in grain or livestock, others in labor. A poor harvest could leave families struggling to survive. Yet obligations remained. Resentment simmered, though open rebellion was rare, for lords commanded soldiers and law courts. Still, history records uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, showing that the oppressed did sometimes rise up when pushed to desperation. Illness was a constant threat. With poor sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and crowded living conditions, disease spread quickly. A simple cut could turn deadly. The great plagues of the Middle Ages struck hardest at peasants, wiping out villages and leaving empty fields. Yet even in ordinary years, life expectancy was short. Many children died young, and adults rarely lived beyond their 40s. And yet, peasant life was not without dignity. Though bound by duty and hardship, peasants carried within them a deep sense of belonging to their land, their families, their communities, and their faith. Their songs, traditions, and resilience endured across centuries, shaping the culture and folklore we still know today. If you woke up as a peasant in medieval times, you would quickly learn that survival was a collective effort. Your hands would blister from farm tools, your meals would be plain but earned through sweat, and your nights would be spent in a smoky cottage with family huddled close. But you would also feel the bonds of community, the rhythm of the seasons, and the grounding strength of a life lived close to the soil. In many ways, the peasants of the Middle Ages lived lives both harsh and meaningful, unseen in chronicles of kings and battles, yet essential to the world that emerged from their labor. To live in medieval Europe was to live under the shadow of the church. Its spires rose above villages, its bells marked the passing hours, and its teachings shaped every stage of life, from birth to death, and even beyond. For a peasant, a knight, or even a king, the church was not simply a place of worship, but the very backbone of society. To wake up in the Middle Ages was to wake up in a world where faith was inseparable from daily existence. The church's presence was everywhere, even in the smallest villages. Most communities centered around a parish church, a modest stone or wooden building with a steeple that could be seen across the fields. Here, peasants gathered not only for Sunday Mass, but also for baptisms, weddings, funerals, and festivals. The priest, often one of the few literate men in the village, acted as spiritual guide, teacher, and mediator. For many, he was the face of God on earth. Religion shaped the rhythm of time itself. The day was divided by the ringing of church bells, dawn prayers, noon prayers, and evening prayers. The year revolved around the liturgical calendar, Advent, Lent, Easter, and Christmas, punctuated by saints' days and feast days. For peasants, these holy days were both spiritual obligations and rare opportunities for rest from endless toil. Festivals were a blend of sacred and social life, with processions, games, and communal feasts. The church taught that every soul had two paths: salvation or damnation. Heaven was the eternal reward for a life of faith and obedience, while hell was a place of unimaginable torment. Purgatory, a state of purification between the two, loomed large in medieval minds. These beliefs gave weight to every decision and shaped behavior at every level of society. Even small sins could feel heavy when the fate of one's eternal soul was at stake. One of the most powerful institutions of the church was the system of sacraments, rituals believed to channel God's grace. Baptism welcomed infants into the Christian community. Marriage bound couples under God. Confession allowed sinners to seek forgiveness, and the Eucharist connected believers directly to Christ through bread and wine. From cradle to grave, these sacraments marked life's milestones, reminding everyone of their place in God's plan. Tithers were another constant presence. Every peasant owed 1/10 of their harvest to the church, whether in grain, livestock, or labor. This was in addition to the dues owed to their lord. Though the tithe was often resented, it reinforced the church's role as both spiritual and economic power. Wealth collected through tithers, donations, and land holdings made the medieval church one of the richest institutions in Europe. Monasteries and convents extended the church's influence even further. Scattered across the countryside, these religious houses were places of prayer, scholarship, and charity. Monks and nuns lived disciplined lives devoted to God, following strict routines of worship, study, and manual labor. But monasteries also served their communities, offering food to the poor, shelter to travelers, and medical care to the sick. Many preserved ancient texts, copying manuscripts by hand, ensuring that knowledge survived even in turbulent times. The church also shaped ideas of morality and law. To disobey one's lord was a crime, but to disobey the church was heresy, an offense that threatened both soul and society. Trials by ordeal, excommunications, and public penance were all ways of enforcing religious discipline. Yet, the church was not only a force of fear, it was also a place of comfort. In an uncertain world filled with famine, disease, and war, faith offered hope of meaning beyond suffering. Architecture revealed the church's power in stone. In villages, the church might be small and plain, but in cities, cathedrals rose like mountains of faith. Gothic cathedrals, with their pointed arches, and stained glass windows, and soaring spires, were awe-inspiring symbols of divine majesty. For ordinary people, entering such a space was like stepping into heaven itself, with colored light flooding through saints' images and music echoing off vast stone walls. The church's influence reached into politics as well. Kings sought the Pope's blessing to legitimize their rule, and disputes between rulers often involved the church as mediator. The Pope, seated in Rome, could crown emperors or strip them of power through excommunication. This gave the church authority not only over souls, but over kingdoms. Wars were even waged in its name, most famously the Crusades, called by the Pope to reclaim the Holy Land. For ordinary villagers, however, the church was less about popes and kings and more about daily life. It was where people confessed sins, prayed for good harvests, sought blessings for newborns, and mourned the dead. Candles burned for loved ones, prayers rose for protection from plague, and bells tolled when danger or death struck. Religion was woven into every thread of existence. Even leisure carried religious overtones. Mystery plays dramatized Bible stories in village squares, teaching faith through entertainment. Pilgrimages, journeys to holy shrines like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela, gave people a sense of adventure and spiritual renewal. Relics of saints, from bones to pieces of clothing, were revered as sources of healing and protection. For all its power, the church was also criticized. Some priests lived in luxury while peasants went hungry. Corruption, greed, and abuses of authority gave rise to tensions that, centuries later, would spark the Reformation. But during the medieval period, few dared to openly challenge its authority. Faith remained the foundation upon which lives were built. If you woke up in medieval times, the church would surround you from the moment you opened your eyes to the moment you closed them. You would hear its bells, obey its calendar, pay its tithers, and rely on its rituals to guide you through life and beyond. Whether you were a peasant bowing in prayer, a monk chanting psalms, or a king kneeling before a bishop, the church defined your world. It was, quite simply, the heart of medieval society. When most people imagine the Middle Ages, one of the first images that comes to mind is that of a knight, clad in shining armor, mounted on a powerful horse, and sworn to defend the weak. Knights embody the romance and drama of medieval history. But behind the glittering image lay a life of discipline, danger, and a strict moral code. If you woke up in medieval times, encountering a knight would mean stepping into a world of honor, warfare, and ideals that shaped centuries of European culture. The path to knighthood began in childhood. Boys of noble birth were sent away around the age of 7 to serve as pages in another lord's household. There, they learned the basics of courtly behavior, manners, music, reading, and religion, while also beginning their training in physical skills like riding and swordplay. At 14, a boy advanced to the rank of squire, serving directly under a knight. He cared for the knight's horse, polished his armor, and accompanied him into battle. Only after years of loyal service and proven courage could a squire be dubbed a knight, often in a ceremonial ritual blessed by the church. Knights were warriors first and foremost. The Middle Ages were a time of frequent conflict, raids, feuds, wars between rival lords, and larger struggles between kingdoms. On the battlefield, knights were the elite soldiers. Clad in chainmail or later plate armor, they carried swords, lances, and shields, riding heavy war horses bred for strength and endurance. Their charge, lances lowered, was a fearsome sight capable of shattering enemy lines. But knights were expected to be more than brutal fighters. They were bound by the code of chivalry, an unwritten but deeply influential set of ideals. Chivalry demanded loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, courtesy to others, and above all, defense of the church and the weak. Knights swore oaths to protect widows, orphans, and the poor, though reality often fell short of the ideal. Still, the code gave knights a higher purpose, setting them apart from ordinary soldiers. Tournaments became a stage where knights could display their prowess without the bloodshed of war. Jousting, in which two armored men charged each other with lances, was both sport and training for battle. The tilt of a lance, the shattering of wood, and the thunder of hooves thrilled crowds. Beyond jousts, tournaments included mock battles, where teams of knights clashed in melees that were anything but gentle. Victorious knights won not only glory, but also ransoms from defeated opponents. Chivalry also intertwined with the ideals of courtly love. Inspired by poets and troubadours, knights were expected to show devotion to noble ladies, often in highly stylized and symbolic ways. A knight might wear a lady's favor, a ribbon or token, into battle or dedicate his victories to her honor. These romances, while not always reflecting real relationships, added a layer of refinement to the martial life of knights, blending war with poetry. Knighthood was costly. Armor was expensive, horses required years of training, and weapons had to be expertly crafted. Only wealthy nobles could afford to maintain the lifestyle. This exclusivity made knighthood a status symbol, as much as a military role. To be knighted was to enter an elite brotherhood, admired and respected by society. Religion played a central role in the knightly life. Many ceremonies of knighthood involved blessings from priests or vigils spent in prayer before the altar. Knights saw themselves as soldiers of Christ, sworn to uphold Christian values. This idea fueled the Crusades, where knights marched to the Holy Land under the banner of the cross, convinced that their battles were part of a divine mission. For all the lofty ideals, knights were human, and the code of chivalry was not always upheld. History records knights who plundered villages, fought ruthlessly for personal gain, or betrayed their oaths. Yet even these failings highlight how powerful the chivalric ideal was. To fall short meant there was a standard to measure against, one that inspired generations. Daily life for a knight was not constant warfare. In peacetime, they trained rigorously, practicing swordsmanship, hunting, and maintaining their gear. Hunting itself was a noble pastime, reinforcing skills of tracking, riding, and using weapons. Knights also acted as enforcers of their lord's justice, protecting his lands and ensuring peasants fulfilled their obligations. They were guardians as much as fighters, their presence a reminder of both security and authority. The image of the knight evolved over time. In the early Middle Ages, knights were simply mounted warriors, often rough and violent. By the High Middle Ages, the ideals of chivalry refined their role, emphasizing courtesy and service. By the late Middle Ages, with the rise of professional armies and new weapons like the longbow and gunpowder, the practical role of knights diminished. Yet their cultural legacy grew ever larger, immortalized in legends like King Arthur and his Round Table. If you woke up in medieval times and crossed paths with a knight, you might first be struck by the sheer presence of his armor. Gleaming steel plates catching the sun, a crest emblazoned on his shield, a sword hanging at his side. To peasants, he would seem larger than life, a figure both to admire and to fear. For within the knight lived a paradox: protector and warrior, servant of God yet man of war, bound by chivalry, yet often caught in the realities of violence and ambition. The knight embodied the ideals and contradictions of the medieval world. To encounter one was to glimpse both the glory and the grit of an age defined by honor, faith, and the clash of steel. If knights were the muscle of the medieval world, castles were its backbone. Rising high above towns, rivers, and valleys, castles were more than just homes for lords and their families. They were fortresses, symbols of authority, and centers of life for entire communities. To wake up in medieval times and see a castle on the horizon was to glimpse the power and protection that defined the feudal age. The earliest castles in Europe were simple moat and bailey structures. A moat was an artificial mound of earth topped with a wooden tower, while the bailey was a walled courtyard at its base. Surrounded by ditches or palisades, these early castles were quick to build, providing immediate defense against raids. They were not elegant, but they were effective. Over time, wood gave way to stone, and castles grew into the massive strongholds that still stand today. At the heart of a stone castle was the keep, a tall, thick, walled tower that served as both residence and last line of defense. The keep housed the lord's family, storerooms, and sometimes even a chapel. Surrounding the keep were curtain walls, reinforced with towers and battlements. These walls were designed for defense. Narrow arrow slits allowed archers to fire at attackers while remaining protected, and parapets gave soldiers cover during sieges. Moats, whether dry ditches or filled with water, added another layer of difficulty for would-be invaders. Drawbridges could be raised, portcullises drop, and gates reinforced with iron spikes. Every part of a castle was built with defense in mind. Yet, castles were not only about keeping enemies out, they were also about showing power. A towering castle visible for miles sent a clear message: this land belonged to someone important, and they had the means to defend it. Life inside a castle was busy. While lords and ladies enjoyed relative luxury compared to peasants, the castle was not just their home. It was the administrative hub of the estate, where rents were collected, disputes settled, and armies mustered. Great halls served as gathering spaces for feasts, courts, and ceremonies. Kitchens bustled with servants preparing meals, while blacksmiths, carpenters, and guards maintained the daily needs of the garrison. Defending a castle required preparation. During times of war, supplies were stockpiled, wells protected, and walls manned day and night. Castles could withstand long sieges, forcing attackers to either starve out the defenders or attempt risky assaults. Siege engines such as trebuchets and battering rams were designed to break through stone walls. But defenders countered with boiling oil, flaming arrows, and rocks hurled from above. It was a deadly chess game played on a massive scale. Despite their fearsome design, castles were not impenetrable. History is full of examples where sieges ended in surrender. Sometimes, bribery or betrayal opened the gates from within. Other times, starvation forced defenders to give up. The 100 Years' War, for example, saw countless castles captured, lost, and recaptured as armies swept across France and England. Castles were also evolving symbols of status. Early fortresses were purely functional, but later medieval castles became increasingly elaborate. Towers grew taller, halls more ornate, and windows larger. Decorative stonework, stained glass, and tapestries turned once bleak interiors into spaces of luxury. By the late Middle Ages, castles were as much palaces as they were fortresses, reflecting the wealth and sophistication of their owners. For the people living nearby, the castle loomed large in daily life. In times of peace, it offered markets, protection, and employment. During war, villagers might seek refuge inside its walls, crowding into the bailey with their livestock. The castle was both a shelter and a reminder of obligation, as peasants owed labor and taxes to the lord, who ruled from within. Religious life was woven into castle existence as well. Many castles contained chapels, where lords and their families attended mass. Monks and priests might serve as advisors, reinforcing the idea that the castle's power was sanctioned by God. Bells ringing from a castle chapel reminded everyone that spiritual authority was never far from political authority. The design of castles varied across regions. In France and England, towering stone keeps and concentric walls dominated. In Germany, castles often rose dramatically on hilltops, their towers overlooking rivers and trade routes. In Spain, Moorish influence introduced distinctive styles, with intricate stone carvings and courtyards. Each castle reflected the culture and geography of its region, yet all shared the same purpose: defense, dominance, and permanence. For someone waking up in medieval times, stepping into a castle would be overwhelming. The walls would rise higher than anything you'd ever seen, their shadows stretching across the countryside. Inside, the contrast between luxury and hardship would be striking. Lords and ladies dined at tables heavy with roasted meats and spiced wines, while servants scurried through smoky kitchens and soldiers patrolled the walls in the biting cold. The decline of castles came with the arrival of gunpowder. Cannons made even the thickest walls vulnerable, and by the late Middle Ages, castles gave way to new forms of fortifications. Yet their cultural power never faded. Castles became the stuff of legend, settings for tales of knights, dragons, and fair maidens. They remain enduring symbols of the medieval world, capturing the imagination even today. Castles were more than stone and mortar. They were living centers of medieval society, fortresses, courts, homes, and symbols all at once. To wake up in their shadow was to wake up in the heart of an age defined by walls and watchtowers, by battles fought and legacies built. They remind us that power in the Middle Ages was not just something one wielded. It was something carved into the very landscape. Waking up in medieval times, one might be struck not only by castles and villages, but also by the imposing serenity of monasteries. These were not mere religious buildings. They were communities dedicated to a life of faith, learning, and labor. Monasteries played a vital role in medieval Europe, acting as centers of spirituality, scholarship, and even economic activity. For a traveler of the medieval mind, understanding the rhythm of monastic life provides a window into both devotion and discipline. A monastery was typically a self-contained complex, often surrounded by walls, with a church at its heart. Monks and nuns followed a strict daily schedule governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized obedience, humility, and balance between prayer and work. The day began at the crack of dawn, with the matin service, followed by lauds, and continued with canonical hours spaced throughout the day. Each prayer punctuated the day, reminding the residents of their spiritual obligations and devotion to God. Morning light would filter through narrow windows, illuminating stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Monks, clad in simple habits of wool or coarse linen, would move quietly through the corridors, their heads bowed in reflection. The air carried the mingling scents of incense, herbs, and the faint aroma of baked bread from the communal kitchen. Silence was a valued part of monastic life. Even conversation was restricted to specific times and purposes. Work was central to the monastic experience. The monks and nuns labored with dedication in the gardens, tending vegetables and herbs to feed the community. Others worked in scriptoriums, meticulously copying manuscripts by hand. These manuscripts, often illuminated with intricate designs and gold leaf, preserved the knowledge of the ancient world and provided the foundation for education in the centuries to come. For a peasant or traveler of medieval times, witnessing a scriptorium in action would be a glimpse into a world where faith and scholarship intersected, where every letter penned was an act of devotion. Beyond prayer and work, monasteries were hubs of hospitality. Guests, pilgrims, and travelers were welcomed, offered food and shelter regardless of social class. Monks might serve as guides, healers, or advisors to the surrounding communities. Many monasteries developed infirmaries, where herbal remedies were prepared to treat the sick. Knowledge of medicine, hygiene, and agriculture flourished within these walls, spreading benefits far beyond the cloistered life. Monasteries were also centers of economic activity. They owned extensive lands, collected rents, and managed farms worked by lay brothers and local peasants. Production of wine, cheese, beer, and wool often took place on site, sustaining both the monastery and the surrounding economy. In many ways, monasteries functioned as microcosms of medieval society, a blend of religion, labor, and governance. Despite their isolation, monasteries were deeply connected to the wider world. They corresponded with other religious centers, exchanging manuscripts and knowledge. Some sent missionaries to distant lands, spreading faith and forging cultural ties. Others acted as political mediators, advising kings and nobles on matters of state. Their influence extended far beyond their stone walls, shaping both spiritual and secular life. Daily routines were rigorous. After the early morning prayers, monks engaged in manual labor, whether tending the fields, tending to livestock, or repairing buildings. Midday brought the sex service, followed by meals in the refectory. Meals were simple but nourishing: bread, pottage, cheese, and vegetables, with meat reserved for special occasions or higher-ranking monks. Silence during meals was often enforced, broken only by readings from scripture or spiritual texts. Afternoons were devoted to study, copying texts or continuing manual work. Evening prayers, including vespers and compline, concluded the day, after which monks retired to their cells for rest. Even in sleep, the rhythm of the day, marked by devotion and discipline, imbued every moment with purpose. This structured life fostered a sense of order and continuity, contrasting sharply with the unpredictability of peasant or knightly life. Monastic life was not without its challenges. Strict discipline could be harsh, and infractions were met with penance. Illness or injury was endured with patience, and worldly pleasures were often forsaken. Yet, for those called to this path, the monastery offered a profound sense of stability, community, and spiritual fulfillment. Life here was insulated from the political upheavals and battles that defined much of the outside world. For medieval peasants, monasteries represented both mystery and aspiration. Some children were sent to monasteries for education, learning to read Latin and acquire skills in music, arithmetic, and theology. Others sought refuge from poverty or conflict. Monasteries preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during turbulent times, acting as anchors of continuity in an often chaotic world. The architectural design of monasteries reflected their purpose. Cloisters, covered walkways surrounding a central garden or courtyard, offered places for reflection and quiet contemplation. The church, often adorned with stained glass and stone carvings, was the focal point of spiritual life. Dormitories, refectories, kitchens, and workshops were arranged to maintain order and efficiency. Each space was designed with a blend of utility, spirituality, and community in mind. Monasteries also played a key role during crises, such as famine, plague, or warfare. They provided food, shelter, and medical care to those in need. Their storehouses and agricultural expertise often allowed them to survive periods of scarcity, becoming vital lifelines for surrounding populations. In this way, monasteries were both spiritual sanctuaries and practical havens. Life in a monastery teaches that medieval existence was not monolithic. While peasants labored in fields and knights fought on battlefields, monks and nuns cultivated knowledge, faith, and order. Their daily routine, a disciplined blend of prayer, work, and study, reveals the multifaceted nature of medieval society, where devotion and practicality intertwined in intricate ways. For a modern visitor, suddenly transported to medieval times, witnessing the steady, contemplative life of a monastery could be a revelation. Here, amidst chants and candlelight, the slow rhythms of labor and prayer created a space where time seemed to stretch, allowing reflection and insight. Monasteries offered a stark contrast to the chaos of war, the unpredictability of village life, and the rigid hierarchies of feudal lords. Ultimately, monasteries were more than religious institutions. They were centers of culture, education, economy, and social support. They preserved the past, shaped the present, and influenced the future. To step into a monastery in medieval times was to step into a world of order, devotion, and quiet resilience, a world that reminds us that human ingenuity and faith can thrive even in the harshest of eras. In medieval times, if you were to step outside the quiet of a monastery or the confines of a village, you would likely encounter the bustling, lively atmosphere of a market. Markets were the lifeblood of medieval society, serving as centers for trade, communication, and community. They were places where peasants, merchants, craftsmen, and travelers came together, exchanging not just goods, but ideas, news, and culture. A modern visitor suddenly transported to this era would be struck by the noise, smells, and sheer energy of a medieval market. The day would begin early, even before the sun had fully risen. Merchants arrived from surrounding towns and villages, often traveling long distances with carts and pack animals loaded with goods. Local farmers brought fresh produce from their fields, grains, vegetables, fruits, dairy, and eggs. Livestock, cows, pigs, chickens, and sheep were herded into pens for sale or trade. Exotic goods, too, could be found, brought by traveling merchants from distant lands, spices from the East, silks from Italy, or fine glassware from the Low Countries. The variety of items on display reflected the complex and interconnected trade networks of medieval Europe. Marketplaces were not merely commercial hubs. They were social spaces. Villagers, travelers, and merchants mingled, shared news, and negotiated deals. Street performers, musicians, and jugglers entertained the crowds, adding color and sound to the lively scene. The smell of freshly baked bread, roasted meats, and fermented aloes filled the air, mingling with the earthy scents of hay, leather, and animals. It was an environment that could be overwhelming, yet exhilarating, for anyone experiencing it for the first time. Bartering was the dominant form of transaction. Coinage existed, but in many rural markets, peasants traded goods directly. A basket of eggs might be exchanged for a loaf of bread or a length of cloth. Merchants set prices based on local demand, seasonality, and the quality of goods. Skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and potters offered their wares, demonstrating techniques to attract buyers. For a traveler from the modern world, observing the intricate craftsmanship and resourcefulness of medieval artisans would be both fascinating and instructive. Markets were also closely tied to religious and civic life. Market days often coincided with feast days, saints' festivals, or fairs, providing opportunities for celebration alongside commerce. Town charters sometimes granted official permission to hold weekly markets or annual fairs, ensuring the local lord or bishop could collect taxes or tolls. These gatherings were more than just economic events. They were cultural milestones, drawing people from across the region. Trade in medieval times extended far beyond local markets. Merchants formed networks that spanned kingdoms and continents. Italian states like Venice and Genoa dominated maritime trade, importing spices, silks, and precious metals from the east. Flanders became a hub for the wool and textile trade, supplying fine cloth to much of Europe. Even small towns were connected to these broader networks, as merchants traveled from village to village, carrying goods, news, and ideas along well-trodden trade routes. The physical layout of a medieval market reflected its purpose. Stalls and booths were arranged in orderly rows, sometimes centered around a town square or churchyard. Goods were displayed in baskets, barrels, or on tables, often accompanied by signs indicating the seller's name and wares. Livestock was penned in designated areas to prevent chaos, while craftsmen worked in nearby workshops or open-air spaces. The market was a microcosm of medieval society, reflecting social hierarchies, economic structures, and communal norms. However, medieval markets were not without their dangers. Pickpockets and thieves operated in crowded spaces, and disputes over prices or goods could escalate quickly. Guilds, which regulated trades and crafts, often enforced rules to maintain fairness and quality, but enforcement was uneven. Health risks were present as well. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, and the presence of animals contributed to the spread of disease. Travelers had to navigate these challenges carefully, blending vigilance with participation in the lively exchanges around them. Currency played a role in trade, particularly in towns and larger cities. Silver coins, gold ducats, and copper pennies circulated, though their value varied by region. Weight and purity of coins were closely monitored, and counterfeit money was a constant concern. The presence of money allowed for more specialized markets, where luxury goods, imported items, and high-value commodities could be bought and sold. These markets attracted wealthier merchants, nobles, and even royal representatives seeking rare items or negotiating important contracts. Women played an important role in market life, both as producers and consumers. Peasant women sold dairy, eggs, and baked goods, while craftswomen offered textiles, embroidery, and household tools. Market attendants provided opportunities for social interaction, networking, and learning about developments in trade, fashion, and local news. For a medieval peasant, the market was one of the few spaces where the broader world could be glimpsed firsthand. Religious influence permeated market life as well. Many markets were established in proximity to churches or cathedrals, and spiritual observances punctuated the day. Monks and clergy often visited to preach, offer guidance, or collect tithes. Holy days affected the rhythm of commerce. Certain days were reserved for fasting or reflection, while others celebrated saints and harvests, drawing large crowds to fairs and markets alike. Medieval markets were also engines of cultural exchange. News stories and rumors traveled alongside goods. Merchants shared tales of foreign lands, strange customs, and exotic products, contributing to a broader awareness of the world beyond local boundaries. Festivals and fairs brought together people from diverse backgrounds, fostering a shared cultural experience and shaping social norms. For a modern observer transported to a medieval market, the experience would be both chaotic and captivating. The sights, sounds, and smells were immersive, painting a vivid picture of a society where commerce, community, and culture intertwined. Every transaction told a story, every stall revealed skill and ingenuity, and every interaction reflected the complex web of medieval life. In conclusion, medieval markets were far more than places to buy and sell. They were centers of economic vitality, social interaction, and cultural exchange. They connected villages to towns, towns to cities, and local communities to the broader world. Markets brought together all levels of society, from peasants to nobles, artisans to clergy, in a shared space governed by custom, law, and human interaction. Experiencing a market in medieval times meant stepping into the heart of daily life, where work, trade, and human connection blended in an ever-changing rhythm of activity, color, and sound. By understanding the role of markets, one gains a deeper appreciation for the economic and social structures that shaped medieval Europe. They reveal a world of resourcefulness, interdependence, and complexity, reminding us that even in an era often described as dark, human ingenuity and community flourished in every corner of life. As you wander through medieval Europe in your mind's eye, one of the most imposing sights you would encounter is the castle. These towering stone fortresses, rising from hillsides, riverbanks, or strategic crossroads, were more than just grand residences. They were military strongholds, administrative centers, and symbols of power. To wake up in medieval times and see a castle dominating the horizon would be to witness firsthand the embodiment of feudal authority, where every wall, tower, and battlement communicated both strength and prestige. The earliest castles were simple wooden motte and bailey structures. A moat was a raised earth mound, often artificially constructed, topped with a wooden keep, while the bailey was an enclosed courtyard at its base, protected by a palisade and ditch. These rudimentary fortifications allowed local lords to defend their holdings effectively against raiders and rival nobles. Wood was abundant and easy to work with, but it was also vulnerable to fire and decay, leading over time to a transition towards stone construction. Stone castles began to appear in the 11th century, often built on the sites of earlier wooden keeps. Their walls were thick, sometimes several meters wide, designed to withstand battering and siege engines. Towers projected from the walls, providing vantage points for archers and guards. Arrow slits, narrow vertical openings in the walls, allowed defenders to shoot without exposing themselves. Moats, sometimes filled with water and sometimes dry, added an additional layer of protection. Drawbridges controlled access, and gatehouses were reinforced with heavy doors and portcullises. Every feature of a castle was carefully designed to repel attack while projecting authority over the surrounding countryside. Life inside a castle was complex and hierarchical. The lord or lady of the castle occupied the central keep, often lavishly decorated with tapestries, carved wood, and stonework. Surrounding courtyards contained stables, kitchens, workshops, and living quarters for soldiers, servants, and administrators. Castles were almost self-contained communities, with blacksmiths forging weapons, bakers supplying bread, and soldiers training to defend the fortification. A castle could sustain its inhabitants for weeks during a siege, storing food, water, and weapons, while signaling towers relayed warnings to neighboring strongholds. The construction of castles required significant resources and labor. Peasants often provided the workforce, either voluntarily as part of feudal obligations or under coercion. Stone had to be quarried, transported and shaped, timber cut and treated, and defensive features carefully planned and executed. Skilled masons, carpenters, and engineers were essential, and the resulting structures often stood for centuries as a testament to the ingenuity and determination of medieval builders. Castles were not just defensive structures. They were centers of administration and justice. The lord presiding over the castle held authority over the surrounding lands, collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes, and enforcing laws. A castle's great hall, with its long tables and high ceilings, was where feasts, councils, and legal proceedings took place. Here, knights and retainers gathered to receive instructions, celebrate victories, or discuss strategy. The presence of a castle reinforced the feudal hierarchy, reminding peasants and townsfolk of the lord's power and obligations. Military life was a central aspect of castle existence. Soldiers trained daily in combat techniques, archery, and siege defense. Knights in shining armor practiced justing and swordsmanship, preparing for campaigns that could extend across regions or even into foreign lands. Castles were often the focal point of military strategy during conflicts, serving as staging grounds for attacks, defensive strongholds during sieges, or refuges for the surrounding population. The sight of banners flying from a castle tower communicated allegiance, wealth, and readiness for battle. Castles also played a psychological role. Their sheer size and fortification inspired awe and fear. To a peasant approaching the castle from a distant field, the towering stone walls symbolized protection for some, oppression for others. They were reminders that authority was absolute and that rebellion or lawlessness would meet with swift reprisal. The architecture itself, thick walls, narrow staircases, and murder holes above entrances, was designed to intimidate intruders and reassure inhabitants of safety. Over time, castles evolved to meet changing military technology and social needs. The introduction of gunpowder and cannons in the late medieval period necessitated thicker walls and lower, angled bastions to absorb artillery fire. Moats were deepened, curtain walls reinforced, and concentric designs, multiple layers of walls and towers, became common. Even as their military importance declined in later centuries, castles continued to serve as noble residences and symbols of power, with luxurious accommodations blending defense with comfort. Daily life in a castle could be rigorous and disciplined. Servants and soldiers had assigned duties, tending fires, maintaining armaments, cooking meals, cleaning chambers, and patrolling walls. The lord and lady oversaw the household and lands, entertained guests, and participated in the social rituals of the nobility. Knights trained with weapons, engaged in hunting expeditions, and attended tournaments to demonstrate skill and loyalty. Festivals, feasts, and ceremonies marked the calendar, often celebrating saints' days, royal marriages, or military victories. Yet beneath the grandeur and pomp, a castle was a place of constant vigilance. Sieges were among the most challenging experiences in castle life. Attacking armies would encircle the stronghold, cutting off supplies, and attempting to breach walls with battering rams, catapults, or siege towers. Defenders relied on archery, boiling oil, and strategic counterattacks. Survival depended on careful planning, rationing food, and maintaining morale. The threat of disease and starvation loomed as much as enemy weapons. For inhabitants, every day under siege was a test of endurance, ingenuity, and courage. Castles also fostered cultural development. Within their walls, manuscripts were copied, music performed, and artistic endeavors pursued. The presence of a court brought poets, musicians, and scholars, blending martial and intellectual pursuits. Architecture itself became a form of art, with decorative stone carvings, stained glass windows, and ornamental motifs transforming functional fortresses into symbols of refinement and taste. In conclusion, castles were far more than mere stone buildings. They were living, breathing centers of medieval life, combining military, political, administrative, and cultural functions. To wake up in the shadow of a castle in medieval times would be to confront the dual nature of these structures, protective yet imposing, functional yet symbolic, communal yet hierarchical. Castles shaped the landscape, dictated the rhythm of life for those around them, and stood as enduring testaments to human ingenuity, ambition, and power. Through their walls, towers, and gates, one can glimpse the complexities of medieval society, the interplay of authority, defense, culture, and daily life. Castles remind us that the Middle Ages were not simply dark or stagnant. They were a period of remarkable architectural, military, and social innovation. Each stone tells a story of toil and triumph, fear and ambition, highlighting the enduring legacy of an era that continues to captivate our imagination centuries later. As we leave the imposing stone walls of castles behind, let us wander into the bustling medieval towns, where the heartbeat of daily life thrummed with energy, commerce, and human interaction. Medieval towns were far smaller than modern cities, but they were dynamic centers of trade, craft, and social activity. Waking up in such a town, you would immediately sense the difference from the quiet countryside. The air would be filled with the scents of freshly baked bread, tanned leather, and the occasional tang of refuse or livestock. The streets would echo with the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the calls of merchants hawking their wares, and the chatter of townsfolk negotiating deals, gossiping, or shouting instructions to apprentices and laborers. Most medieval towns grew organically around castles, monasteries, or trade crossroads. Their layouts were irregular, with narrow winding streets and small market squares at the center. Buildings were often timber, framed, with overhanging upper floors, small windows, and thatched or tiled roofs. Shops and homes were often combined, so a baker might live above the bakery, while a blacksmith resided above the forge. Streets could be crowded and chaotic, particularly during market days or festivals. Yet towns were crucial hubs, connecting rural economies to regional and even international trade networks. One of the first sights you would notice is the marketplace. Merchants and artisans displayed their goods on wooden stalls or in front of their homes. Exotic spices from the east, woolen cloth from nearby farms, iron tools, pottery, and candles filled the market with color and texture. Towns were also home to specialized craftsmen, blacksmiths, shoemakers, coopers, weavers, and carpenters, all contributing to a vibrant economic ecosystem. Apprenticeships ensured that trade skills were passed from generation to generation, and guilds began forming to regulate quality, prices, and labor conditions, giving a measure of organization to the otherwise chaotic streets. The social life of a medieval town was as layered and intricate as its economy. Townspeople were bound together by custom, religion, and mutual dependency. Festivals and religious holidays brought together residents of all social standings to celebrate with processions, feasts, music, and games. Taverns and alehouses were lively centers of conversation and camaraderie, where merchants and laborers alike could discuss news, business, or gossip. Yet towns could also be dangerous, as fires spread quickly through densely packed wooden buildings, and crime, whether theft, pickpocketing, or assault, was a persistent concern. Life in medieval towns was structured around occupation, class, and religion. Wealthier merchants and artisans often lived in sturdier houses near the town center, sometimes adorned with decorative carvings or painted signs. Their influence in town affairs could be significant, especially if they were members of a guild or council. At the other end of the spectrum, laborers, beggars, and transient workers lived in more precarious conditions, often in cramped quarters or makeshift housing. Religious institutions, such as churches and monasteries, played a central role in town life, providing moral guidance, education, and charitable support. Bells from the local church punctuated the day, calling townspeople to prayer, marking curfews, or signaling danger. Trade was the lifeblood of medieval towns. Merchants imported goods from distant regions, exchanging local products for salt, wine, textiles, spices, or luxury items. Market regulations, tolls, and taxes were imposed by town councils or local lords, who sought to maintain order and profit. Fair days were especially important, drawing traders from surrounding villages and regions. These periodic gatherings created opportunities for commerce, cultural exchange, and the dissemination of news, connecting small towns to the broader currents of medieval society. Education in towns was limited, but slowly growing. Wealthy families sometimes employed private tutors, while monasteries and cathedrals offered instruction in Latin, reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Literacy was rare, particularly among the lower classes, but knowledge of trade, craft, and practical skills was highly valued. Towns were incubators of innovation, from improved tools for agriculture and craftsmanship to new methods of trade accounting and record keeping. Health and sanitation were ongoing challenges. Waste was often dumped into the streets or nearby rivers, contaminating water sources and contributing to disease outbreaks. Plagues, such as the Black Death, would later devastate town populations, highlighting the fragility of medieval urban life. Yet despite these risks, towns offered economic and social mobility that the countryside could not. A skilled craftsman or ambitious merchant could rise to prominence, gaining wealth, influence, and even political authority within the town council. Religion permeated everyday life in towns. Churches were not only places of worship, but centers of community, education, and dispute resolution. Patron saints were venerated, processions marked feast days, and sermons communicated both spiritual guidance and practical advice for living within the moral and legal codes of the time. Superstitions also played a role. Townspeople might hang charms to ward off evil, consult astrologers for important decisions, or participate in communal rituals designed to secure bountiful harvests or protect against disease. Towns were not merely economic or religious centers, they were also sites of political negotiation. Town charters, often granted by monarchs or local lords, codified rights, responsibilities, and privileges. Some towns became self-governing, with elected councils or magistrates who administered local justice, regulated markets, and organized defenses. These political structures allowed towns to exert influence beyond their walls, sometimes even challenging the authority of regional lords or kings. Entertainment in medieval towns was diverse, blending the sacred and the secular. traveling minstrels, and performers entertained crowds in town squares, while plays and pageants depicted biblical stories, local legends, or moral lessons. Games such as chess, dice, or ball games provided leisure for both young and old. Public festivals could be spectacular affairs, including jests, mock battles, and elaborate processions. While these activities offered relief from daily toil, they also reinforced social hierarchies, displaying the wealth and influence of the town's elite. Even the architecture of towns reflected social and economic realities. Narrow streets and closely packed buildings maximized space within defensive walls, while public buildings like guild halls, market crosses, and town squares served as focal points for commerce and community life. Wells provided water, while granaries stored surplus to guard against famine. Bridges, gates, and walls defined the boundaries of safety and security, reminding townspeople of both protection and confinement. In conclusion, life in medieval towns was a complex interplay of labor, commerce, religion, and social interaction. The streets were alive with activity, the markets vibrant with trade, and the guilds and councils providing structure and stability. Waking up in such a town, you would experience the energy and rhythm of medieval urban life firsthand. The smells, sounds, and sights of a society balancing opportunity with hardship, community with hierarchy. Towns offered both promise and challenge. The chance to rise through skill and trade, the constant vigilance required to survive, and the ever-present influence of religion, law, and social custom. They were living organisms, shaped by the people who inhabited them, their ambitions, their fears, and their daily routines. Through towns, one glimpses the broader tapestry of medieval life, the interconnections between peasants, craftsmen, merchants, lords, and clergy, and the ways in which human ingenuity, resilience, and ambition shaped a world both familiar and alien to our modern eyes. As night falls and the town settles into quiet, candlelight flickering in windows, you can imagine the same world continuing its rhythm, watchmen patrolling the streets, bakers finishing their late night loaves, and families preparing for the next day's work. In this way, medieval towns were not simply relics of history. They were the dynamic heart of a society that laid the foundations for much of the modern world. And as you drift into sleep, let your imagination linger on the cobbled streets, the bustling markets, and the flickering torches of medieval towns, appreciating the vibrancy, hardship, and enduring legacy of life in the Middle Ages.